Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey through the hidden chapters of history that your textbooks never dared to tell you. What if I told you that some of the most powerful men who ever lived, conquerors who shaped civilizations, emperors who built monuments that still stand today, carried secrets so profound that entire empires worked to erase them? Tonight, we're uncovering the truth about 30 kings whose love stories were written in whispers and buried in shame. These aren't just rumours or gossip, these are documented relationships that historians have spent centuries trying to downplay or ignore completely. And we're starting with two names you definitely know, but whose real stories will absolutely blow your mind. Now, before we dive into these incredible untold stories together, I'd love it if you could show some love by hitting that subscribe button and giving this video a thumbs up. But only if you're genuinely enjoying what we're exploring tonight. I'm really curious too. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know if you're a night owl like me, or maybe you're on the other side of the world starting your day with some hidden history. Now let's dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's uncover these ancient secrets that have been hidden for far too long. Our first stop takes us back over 2,000 years to ancient Macedonia, where a young prince was about to become the most feared conqueror in human history. But behind Alexander, the Great's legendary military campaigns, was a love story so intense that it would define not just his personal life, but the very fate of his empire. Picture this. It's 356 BC, and in the royal court of Macedonia, two boys are growing up together. One is Alexander, son of King Philip, destined for greatness. The other is Hephaestion, a nobleman's son who would become Alexander's closest companion. But here's what they don't teach you in school. These two weren't just best friends or military allies. Ancient sources, including the historian Plutarch, describe a relationship so intimate and exclusive that it scandalized even the relatively open-minded Greeks. Alexander and Hephaestion were inseparable from childhood. They studied together under Aristotle, trained together as warriors, and when Alexander began his conquest of the known world, Hephaestion was always by his side, not just as a general, but as what the Greeks called his philos, his beloved. Ancient writers describe how Alexander would share his tent with Hephaestion, how they performed rituals together at the tomb of Achilles and Patroclus, the legendary Greek lovers, symbolically declaring their own relationship to the world. But here's where it gets really interesting. When they visited Troy, Alexander laid a wreath at Achilles' tomb while Hephaestion honoured Patroclus. This wasn't random. They were publicly comparing themselves to history's most famous same-sex couple. The message was clear to anyone who understood Greek culture. Yet somehow this detail gets conveniently left out of most history books. The depth of their relationship becomes even more apparent when we look at what happened when Hephaestion died suddenly in 324 BC. Alexander didn't just mourn, he completely lost his mind with grief. He ordered the execution of Hephaestion's doctor. He had the manes and tails cut from every horse and mule in the army as a sign of mourning. He spent a fortune building a massive funeral pyre that could be seen for miles. Ancient historians say Alexander threw himself on Hephaestion's body and refused to eat or drink for days. But here's the detail that really tells you everything you need to know about their relationship. Alexander consulted the oracle at Siwa, asking if he could worship Hephaestion as a god. When that was denied, he settled for having him worshipped as a divine hero. Think about that for a moment. The man who conquered most of the known world was so devastated by the loss of his companion that he wanted to literally make him a god. Now, let's jump forward about 300 years to Rome, where another emperor was about to shock the ancient world with his own forbidden love. Emperor Hadrian is remembered today for building that famous wall across northern Britain, but his most passionate relationship wasn't with any of his wives. It was with a beautiful young man from Egypt named Antinous. Hadrian met Antinous around 123 AD when the boy was probably just a teenager. What started as a typical Roman mentor-student relationship quickly became something much deeper and more scandalous. Unlike Alexander and Hephaestion, who grew up together as equals, Hadrian was a middle-aged emperor falling deeply in love with someone young enough to be his son, and he didn't care who knew it. Antinous travelled everywhere with Hadrian, appearing in official court ceremonies and state functions. Ancient coins from the period show Antinous' face alongside Hadrian's, an unprecedented honour for someone with no official title or royal blood. The emperor commissioned hundreds of statues of his young lover, more than any other private individual in Roman history. We're talking about a level of public devotion that would have been shocking, even by Roman standards. But here's where the story takes a tragic turn that reveals just how deep their connection really was. In 130 AD, while travelling through Egypt, Antinous mysteriously drowned in the Nile River. The official story was that it was an accident, but many historians believe it was either suicide or some kind of ritual sacrifice. Hadrian's reaction was immediate and extreme. He declared Antinous a god, founded an entire city in his honour called Antinopolis, and established a religious cult that would survive for centuries. Think about the power and audacity of that decision. Hadrian literally created a new religion centred around his dead lover. He ordered temples built across the empire where people would worship Antinous as a deity. Ancient sources tell us that Hadrian wept openly at official functions and refused to remove his mourning clothes for months. This wasn't just grief. This was a man whose entire world had collapsed. What makes both of these stories so powerful is how they reveal the incredible lengths these rulers went to honour relationships that their societies officially couldn't recognise. Alexander's empire stretched from Greece to India, yet he risked political instability by showing such extreme favouritism to one man. Hadrian controlled the most powerful military machine in human history, yet he used that power to immortalise a forbidden love. But here's what's really fascinating. Both Alexander and Hadrian were married to women for political reasons. Both fathered children or adopted heirs. Both maintained the public appearance of traditional masculine rulers. Yet their deepest emotional connections, their most profound loves, were with men. And the historical evidence is overwhelming if you know where to look. The tragic irony is that both relationships ended with devastating loss that ultimately weakened these great rulers. Alexander died less than a year after Hephaestion, many believe from grief, and the destructive lifestyle he adopted after losing his companion. Hadrian, though he lived longer, never recovered from Antinous' death and spent his final years obsessed with preserving his lover's memory. These weren't just powerful men having affairs, these were love stories so intense they shaped the course of empires. Yet for centuries historians have downplayed these relationships, calling them close friendships or mentorships. The evidence has always been there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to acknowledge what ancient people knew all along. But Alexander and Hadrian were just the beginning. As we move through history, we'll discover that medieval Europe held even darker secrets, where Christian kings had to be far more careful about their forbidden desires. Coming up next, we're travelling to the age of Crusades and Holy Wars, where two of the most famous medieval rulers, one a legendary warrior king, the other a monarch who literally rewrote the Bible, both harboured secrets that would have destroyed their reigns if discovered. The story of Richard the Lionheart and King James might just be the most shocking revelation yet. Welcome to the age of holy wars and divine kings, where the cross and the crown created a deadly combination for anyone harbouring forbidden desires. We're stepping into medieval Europe, a time when being discovered in the wrong bed didn't just mean scandal, it meant eternal damnation. Yet even in this world of religious terror, two of the most powerful monarchs in history couldn't resist the pull of forbidden love. And the first one might completely change how you think about the Crusades. Richard the Lionheart. Just hearing that name probably brings up images of a heroic Christian warrior, the noble king who left England to fight the infidels in the Holy Land. Hollywood loves this guy. But here's what they don't tell you in the movies. Richard spent barely 6 months of his 10-year reign actually in England. He was far more interested in his campaigns abroad, and specifically in a certain French king who was supposed to be his enemy. Picture this scene from 1187. 2 young men, both destined to be kings, meeting at the court of Henri II. Richard, the future King of England, is 29. Philip Augustus, heir to the French throne, is just 22. By every political calculation, these two should hate each other. England and France had been enemies for generations. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Contemporary chroniclers describe how Richard and Philip became so close that they ate from the same dish and slept in the same bed. Now, before you think, well, maybe that was just normal medieval friendship, let me give you some context. Medieval chronicles were written by monks and church officials who were very careful about their language. When they bothered to mention that 2 men were sharing a bed, especially 2 kings, that was their polite way of saying something much more intimate was happening. Gerald of Wales, a contemporary historian, wrote that Philip and Richard showed such great affection towards each other that the Lord King of England was struck with great admiration. But here's the really telling detail. When Richard's father, King Henry II, saw how close his son had become with the French prince, he became extremely fearful and tried to separate them. Think about that. Henry II was worried about a political alliance, sure, but his reaction suggests he recognized something deeper and more dangerous. The relationship between Richard and Philip becomes even more fascinating when you look at what happened during the Third Crusade. These 2 men, who had been inseparable, were now supposed to work together to recapture Jerusalem from Saladin. But instead of focusing on their holy mission, they spent most of their time in increasingly bitter personal conflicts. Historical accounts describe jealous rages, public arguments that shocked their own advisors, and reconciliations that were far too emotional for mere political allies. Here's where it gets really interesting. Philip suddenly abandoned the crusade in 1191, claiming illness. But many historians believe he left because he couldn't handle watching Richard's growing obsession with military glory, and possibly other relationships. Richard, meanwhile, seemed to completely lose interest in returning home to his wife, Queen Berengaria of Navarre. And speaking of Berengaria, let's talk about one of the most telling pieces of evidence about Richard's true nature. He married her in 1191 for political reasons, but get this, they had no children, and she spent most of their marriage living separately from him. Medieval queens had one job above all others: producing heirs. The fact that Richard showed so little interest in this crucial duty was scandalous enough that church officials repeatedly pressured him about it. But the most damning evidence comes from Richard's own actions. In 1195, a hermit named Fulk of Neuilly publicly accused Richard of having 3 daughters that he needed to get rid of: pride, greed, and lust. But when Richard asked what he should do with them, his response was telling. He gave pride to the Knights Templar, greed to the Cistercian monks, and lust to his barons. Medieval audiences would have understood this as a veiled reference to his sexual relationships with men, particularly those in his inner circle. Now let's jump forward about 400 years to a completely different kind of scandal. If Richard's story is about passionate, destructive love, then King James I of England gives us something even more complex. A married king who openly flaunted his male lovers in front of his court and somehow managed to keep his throne. James III is famous for commissioning the King James Bible, the version that millions of Americans still read today. But here's the irony. The man who gave us the most influential English translation of Christianity's holy book was living in direct violation of its teachings about same-sex relationships, and he didn't seem to care who knew it. James had not one, but several well-documented relationships with handsome young men throughout his reign. The most famous was with George Villiers, who James elevated from a minor nobleman to the Duke of Buckingham, making him one of the most powerful men in England. And James was not subtle about it. Contemporary accounts describe how James would fondle Villiers in public, call him his sweet child and wife, and shower him with gifts worth millions in today's money. The Venetian ambassador, Antonio Foscarini, wrote detailed reports back to Venice describing James's extraordinary affection for Villiers, and noting that the king caresses him publicly and in private. When a Venetian diplomat is shocked by public displays of affection, you know it's pretty extreme. But here's what makes James's story so fascinating. Unlike Richard, who tried to maintain some level of discretion, James seemed to revel in shocking people. He once wrote a letter to Villiers saying, "I naturally so love your person as I cannot be happy without you." In another letter, he called himself "your dear dad and husband." These weren't private notes that historians discovered centuries later. These were official correspondence that went through royal channels. The English court was absolutely scandalised. Francis Osborne, a contemporary writer, described how courtiers were disgusted by James's behaviour, writing that the king would tumble and kiss Villiers in front of foreign ambassadors. But here's the crazy part. Nobody could do anything about it. James was king by divine right, and as long as he produced heirs with his wife Anne of Denmark, his personal life was technically untouchable. And he did produce heirs, including the future Charles III. But court observers noted that James showed far more emotional investment in his relationships with men than he ever did with his wife. Anne of Denmark reportedly complained bitterly about being ignored in favour of the king's male favourites. Before Villiers, there was Robert Carr, who James elevated to the Earl of Somerset. James met Carr when the young man was just a page, and their relationship became so intense that other courtiers started plotting against Carr out of jealousy. When Carr eventually fell from favour, partly due to a murder scandal, James was so devastated that courtiers described him as inconsolable for months. What's really remarkable about both Richard and James is how their forbidden relationships affected their effectiveness as rulers. Richard's obsession with his crusades and his complex relationship with Philip Augustus meant he neglected England so thoroughly that his brother John was able to seize power. James's favouritism toward his male companions created massive political instability, with nobles constantly plotting against whichever young man currently held the king's affections. Yet both men maintained their power precisely because they were kings. Richard could abandon his kingdom for years because his reputation as a warrior was so legendary that people forgave his absence. James could openly flout moral conventions because he successfully played the role of the divinely appointed monarch who was answerable only to God. These stories reveal something profound about medieval and early modern Europe. There was often a strange double standard when it came to powerful men and forbidden relationships. What would have been a death sentence for a common person could be overlooked or at least tolerated in a king. But only if he was careful about maintaining certain appearances. The tragedy in both cases is how these relationships ultimately isolated the kings from their own people. Richard died in 1199 from an infected wound, far from England, with no clear heir because he'd never bothered to secure his succession. James III managed to die peacefully in his bed, but his reign was marked by constant political turmoil, largely caused by his refusal to hide his personal preferences. What strikes me most about these stories is how they show us that even in the most repressive periods of European history, human desire found a way to express itself. These weren't weak or confused men. They were kings who commanded armies and shaped nations, yet they risked everything for love. But as we move deeper into history, we'll discover that some rulers found more sophisticated ways to navigate these dangerous waters. Just ahead, we're entering the Renaissance, where Italian princes and French kings turned forbidden desire into an art form, creating elaborate court systems that allowed for relationships that would have been impossible in medieval times. The stories of Lorenzo de Medici and Henri III will show us how power, wealth, and cultural sophistication could create spaces for love that officially didn't exist. The Renaissance changed everything. Suddenly, Europe was obsessed with beauty, art, and the classical world where same-sex relationships weren't just tolerated, they were celebrated. But this cultural revolution created a fascinating paradox. While the Catholic Church's power remained absolute, wealthy princes and kings found incredibly creative ways to live double lives. And nobody mastered this dangerous game better than two men who turned forbidden desire into high art. Let's start in Florence, the beating heart of the Renaissance, where the most powerful family in Italy was about to produce one of history's most sophisticated lovers. Lorenzo de Medici, known as the Magnificent, wasn't just a ruler. He was a poet, a philosopher, and a patron of the arts who practically invented the concept of the Renaissance prince. But beneath all that cultural refinement was a man whose deepest passions lay in directions that could have destroyed everything he'd built. Here's what makes Lorenzo's story so captivating. He didn't just have relationships with men, he wrote poetry about them. In 15th century Italy, while the Inquisition was burning people for far less, Lorenzo was composing love sonnets to beautiful young men and sharing them at dinner parties with cardinals and bishops. The audacity is absolutely breathtaking. One of his most famous poems, written around 1470, describes his love for a young man named Tommaso. Your eyes, so bright and clear, pierce through my heart like arrows of gold. But here's the genius part. Lorenzo wrote these poems in the style of classical Greek and Roman verse, essentially hiding his contemporary relationships behind the acceptable veneer of scholarly appreciation for ancient culture. He was basically saying, I'm not writing gay poetry, I'm just really into classical literature. And it worked. Lorenzo's most documented relationship was with Girolamo Benivieni, a Florentine philosopher and poet who lived in the Medici palace for years. Contemporary sources describe how the two men were inseparable, sharing not just living quarters but intellectual pursuits and what court observers delicately called intimate philosophical discussions. Angelo Poliziano, one of the greatest humanist scholars of the time, wrote extensively about their relationship in terms that leave little doubt about its nature. But here's where Lorenzo's story gets really interesting. He managed to maintain this lifestyle while being married to Clarice Orsini and producing 4 children. The key was the Renaissance concept of different types of love. Following classical models, Lorenzo and his circle distinguished between matrimonial love, which was about family and politics, and spiritual love, which was about intellectual and emotional connection. Guess which category his relationships with men fell into? Lorenzo's court became famous throughout Europe for its tolerance and sophistication. Young men from noble families would come to Florence specifically to join what was essentially a refined, intellectual version of a gay community. They studied philosophy, wrote poetry, created art, and formed relationships that would have been impossible anywhere else in Europe. Lorenzo didn't just protect himself, he created an entire cultural environment where forbidden love could flourish under the protection of classical scholarship and artistic patronage. The evidence is everywhere if you know how to read it. Lorenzo commissioned countless artworks featuring beautiful young men in mythological settings: David, Ganymede, Adonis. His personal library contained more Greek texts about same-sex relationships than anywhere else in Europe. He funded scholars who specialized in translating classical works that the church usually banned. He was essentially using his wealth and power to create a Renaissance gay scene right under the Pope's nose. Now let's travel north to France, where another Renaissance ruler was taking a completely different approach to the same challenges. If Lorenzo was subtle and sophisticated, Henri III of France was dramatic, flamboyant, and absolutely shameless about his preferences. And somehow, he got away with it for nearly 15 years. Henri III became king in 1574, and from the very beginning, his court was unlike anything France had ever seen. He surrounded himself with young, beautiful noblemen called les mignons, the darlings, and treated them like a combination of advisors, courtiers, and lovers. These weren't just favourites or close friends. Contemporary sources describe relationships so intimate and exclusive that foreign ambassadors wrote shocked reports back to their home countries. Pierre de l'Estoile, a contemporary chronicler, described Henri's mignons in detail. They wore their hair long and curled, dressed in silk and velvet, perfumed themselves like women, and shared the king's bed openly. The Venetian ambassador wrote that Henri loves men more than women and cannot hide his passion. These weren't rumours or gossip. These were official diplomatic reports. Henri's most famous relationship was with Anne de Joyeuse, whom he elevated to duke and showered with gifts worth millions in today's currency. When Joyeuse got married, for political reasons, Henri threw a wedding celebration that lasted 15 days and cost so much money that it nearly bankrupted the royal treasury. But here's the really telling detail. Henri was so emotionally distraught about the marriage that courtiers described him as inconsolable and acting like a jealous lover. The court records from Henri's reign are absolutely fascinating because they show how he essentially institutionalized his relationships with men. He created new court positions specifically for his favorites, gave them apartments in the royal palaces, and established elaborate ceremonies where they would dress him, accompany him to mass, and sleep in his chambers. He turned forbidden relationships into official court protocol. But Henri's story reveals something crucial about how these Renaissance rulers navigated religious and political pressure. Unlike medieval kings who had to hide their relationships, Henri survived by being so openly theatrical about everything that people couldn't quite tell what was real versus performance. He would dress in elaborate costumes, wear makeup and jewellery, and host masquerade balls where gender roles were deliberately confused. In a strange way, his flamboyance provided cover for his relationships. Contemporary accounts describe how Henri would appear at court functions wearing pearl earrings, silk gowns, and elaborate headdresses. The Spanish ambassador wrote that the king dresses and behaves more like a woman than a man. But here's the genius part. By making everything so theatrical and excessive, Henri made it impossible for his enemies to pin down exactly what they were accusing him of. Was he gay? Was he just really into fashion? Was this some kind of political statement? The ambiguity protected him. Both Lorenzo and Henri show us how the Renaissance created new possibilities for powerful men to live authentically while maintaining their positions. But they also reveal the enormous energy that went into managing these double lives. Lorenzo spent a fortune funding classical scholarship partly to create intellectual cover for his lifestyle. Henry turned his entire court into an elaborate performance that exhausted everyone around him. What's really remarkable is how both men used cultural innovation to create space for forbidden relationships. Lorenzo essentially invented Renaissance humanism partly as a way to make same-sex relationships intellectually respectable. Henri pioneered new forms of court entertainment and ceremony that normalized intimate relationships between men. They weren't just living secret lives. They were shaping their entire cultures to accommodate their authentic selves. But the psychological cost was enormous. Lorenzo's poetry is filled with references to secrecy, danger, and the pain of loving someone you can't publicly acknowledge. Henry's court became so theatrical and artificial that observers described it as exhausting and surreal. Both men created elaborate systems that allowed them to love freely, but those systems required constant maintenance and performance. The tragedy is that both died relatively young, Lorenzo at 43, Henri at 38, and their deaths mark the end of the tolerant, sophisticated worlds they'd created. Lorenzo's Florence gradually became more conservative under his successors. Henry's court was disbanded immediately after his assassination, and his mignons were scattered or killed. These Renaissance stories show us something profound about the relationship between power, culture, and personal freedom. Both Lorenzo and Henri discovered that you could use wealth, artistic patronage, and cultural innovation to create spaces for authentic living, even in repressive societies. But those spaces were fragile and required enormous resources to maintain. As we continue our journey through history, we'll see how different cultures handled these same challenges in completely different ways. Coming up, we're venturing into the Ottoman Empire, where the most powerful sultans in Islamic history created their own systems for forbidden relationships, systems so sophisticated and secretive that they remained hidden from Western historians for centuries. The stories of Mehmed the Conqueror and Murad IV will show us how empire and desire intersected in ways that would shock even our Renaissance princes. Now we're crossing into a completely different world, one where the rules about power, religion, and forbidden desire operated by entirely different logic. The Ottoman Empire at its height controlled 3 continents and ruled over 50 million people, making it the most powerful force on earth. But hidden within the magnificent palaces of Constantinople was a system so sophisticated for managing royal relationships that it remained secret from Western historians until very recently. What we're about to discover will completely change how you think about Islamic culture and imperial power. Picture Constantinople in 1453. The city that had been the heart of the Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years is about to fall to a 21-year-old sultan who would reshape the entire world. Mehmed II, known to history as the Conqueror, was brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely obsessed with both classical culture and beautiful young men, and unlike our European kings, he didn't have to hide it. Here's what's fascinating about Ottoman culture. While Christian Europe was burning people for same-sex relationships, the Islamic world had a completely different approach. Persian and Turkish poetry celebrated male beauty. Intellectual relationships between men and boys were considered noble, and the Ottoman court system actually institutionalized these relationships in ways that would have shocked medieval Europeans. Mehmed II grew up reading Persian poetry that openly celebrated love between men. His personal library, which still exists, contains hundreds of manuscripts about classical male beauty and philosophical relationships. But more importantly, he inherited a court system where sultans traditionally had both wives for political alliances and male companions for emotional and intellectual connection. The most documented of Mehmed's relationships was with a young Greek noble named Radu Frumos, Radu the Beautiful, who'd been brought to the Ottoman court as a hostage. Byzantine chronicles describe how Mehmed became so infatuated with Radu that he learned Greek poetry specifically to write verses for him. When Radu was eventually sent back to Wallachia as a ruler friendly to the Ottomans, Mehmed reportedly wept openly in court. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Ottoman court records, written in Ottoman Turkish, describe these relationships using specific terminology that showed they were recognized and acceptable. Mehmed's companions weren't hidden lovers. They were mashouks, officially recognized favorites who had specific roles in court hierarchy. They received titles, salaries, and apartments in the palace. This wasn't a secret. It was part of the governmental structure. The Byzantine historian Leonikos Chalkokondyles, who lived through the conquest of Constantinople, wrote detailed accounts of Mehmed's court that include descriptions of his relationships with young men. What's remarkable is that Chalkokondyles, a Christian writing for a Christian audience, doesn't present these relationships as scandalous, just as foreign and different from Byzantine customs. Mehmed's relationship with Radu wasn't just personal, it became a crucial part of his political strategy. By placing a lover on the throne of Wallachia, Mehmed created a buffer state that remained loyal to the Ottoman Empire for decades. This wasn't just about desire, it was about using emotional connections to build political alliances in ways that European kingdoms couldn't imagine. But the most telling evidence about Mehmed's relationships comes from his behaviour after the conquest of Constantinople. While his army was expecting weeks of looting and celebration, Mehmed immediately began converting the city into a cultural centre that would rival Renaissance Florence. He imported Greek scholars, built libraries, and commissioned artworks that celebrated classical male beauty. He was essentially creating his ideal environment for the kind of sophisticated relationships he valued. Ottoman court poetry from Mehmed's reign is filled with references to the Sultan's appreciation for beautiful young men. Poets like Ahmed Pasha wrote elaborate verses describing the Sultan's favourites, and these poems were read aloud at court functions. In one famous poem, Ahmed Pasha describes how the Sultan's heart burns like a moth around the flame of beauty, clearly referring to Mehmed's infatuation with a particular young courtier. Now let's jump forward about 150 years to another Ottoman Sultan who took these traditions in a completely different direction. Murad IV is remembered by historians as one of the most brutal rulers in Ottoman history, a man who personally executed thousands of people and banned everything from coffee to tobacco. But this terrifying Sultan had a secret that reveals a completely different side of his personality. Murad IV ruled from 1623 to 1640, during one of the most chaotic periods in Ottoman history. The empire was facing rebellions, military defeats, and economic crisis. Murad's response was to impose absolute control through violence and terror. He would personally patrol the streets of Constantinople at night, executing anyone he found violating his decrees. Contemporary accounts describe him as paranoid, unpredictable, and absolutely ruthless. But French diplomatic records from the period tell a completely different story about Murad's private life. The French ambassador, Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, wrote detailed reports describing the Sultan's intimate relationship with a young Janissary officer named Kara Mustafa. According to Tavernier, Murad would spend hours in private with Kara Mustafa, discussing poetry and philosophy in complete contrast to his public persona as a tyrant. What makes Murad's story so fascinating is how he used his absolute power to create a private world where he could be completely different from his public image. Ottoman court records describe elaborate private ceremonies where Murad would gather with a small group of young male courtiers for poetry readings and intellectual discussions. These gatherings were so secretive that most of his own ministers didn't know they existed. The Venetian merchant and explorer Evliya Çelebi, who spent time at Murad's court, wrote in his travel memoirs about the Sultan's tender side that was visible only to a select few. Çelebi describes how Murad would transform completely in the presence of his favourites, becoming gentle, intellectual and almost scholarly, the exact opposite of the terrifying ruler everyone else knew. But here's what's really remarkable about both Mehmed and Murad. They represent two completely different ways of handling the same basic human needs within the Ottoman system. Mehmed was open, cultured, and used his relationships as part of his public political strategy. Murad was secretive, paranoid, and created a hidden world where he could express vulnerability and tenderness that would have been impossible in his public role. The key difference between Ottoman rulers and their European counterparts was the cultural framework they inherited. While Christian Europe was increasingly repressive about same-sex relationships, the Ottoman Empire maintained Persian and Central Asian traditions that recognized multiple forms of love and companionship. This doesn't mean it was completely tolerant. There were still boundaries and expectations, but it created space for relationships that would have been impossible in London or Paris. What's really striking is how both sultans used their absolute power to protect and institutionalize relationships that remained intensely personal. Mehmed created an entire cultural environment that celebrated the kind of beauty and intellect he valued. Murad carved out private spaces where he could escape the brutal requirements of his public role. The tragic irony is that both men ultimately died isolated and alone, despite having the power to command anything they wanted. Mehmed died at 50, probably poisoned, with rumours that his grief over losing several young favourites had made him careless about his own safety. Murad died at 28, possibly from alcohol poisoning, having become increasingly paranoid and unable to trust anyone, even his closest companions. These Ottoman stories reveal something profound about how cultural context shapes personal possibility. While European kings had to choose between authenticity and power, Ottoman sultans inherited systems that allowed for both, but only within very specific parameters. The sophistication of their solutions shows just how much energy and creativity goes into navigating forbidden desire when you have unlimited resources. But as we return to Europe, we'll discover that some of the most familiar names in English history were fighting these same battles in their own unique ways. Coming up, we're diving into stories that will completely change how you think about English royal history. Tales of kings whose forbidden relationships literally shaped the modern world, where love and political disaster became so intertwined that they're impossible to separate. Back to the land where Shakespeare would one day write about kings and forbidden love. Except the real stories were far more dramatic than anything he ever put on stage. English royal history is filled with tales of political intrigue and romantic scandal, but two kings in particular managed to turn forbidden desire into national catastrophe. Their stories reveal how dangerous it could be when personal passion collided with political reality in medieval and early modern England. Edward II came to the throne in 1307 with everything going for him. He was young, physically imposing, and heir to one of the most successful kings in English history. His father, Edward III, had conquered Wales and nearly conquered Scotland, leaving behind a powerful kingdom and a clear path to military glory. But Edward I had absolutely no interest in following that path. Instead, he was completely obsessed with a young Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston, and this obsession would ultimately destroy both of them. Here's what makes Edward's story so compelling. This wasn't a hidden relationship or a secret affair. Edward made Gaveston the Earl of Cornwall, one of the most powerful titles in England, within months of becoming king. He gave him lands worth millions in today's currency, and appointed him regent when Edward had to leave the country. Contemporary chroniclers describe how Edward would publicly embrace Gaveston, call him his brother, and shower him with gifts that outraged the English nobility. The Chronicle of Lionheart, written by contemporary monks, describes Edward's behaviour toward Gaveston in language that leaves no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The king upon his return from France kept not company with his wife, but with Piers Gaveston. Another chronicler, the author of the Vita Edwardi Secundi, wrote that Edward loved him above all mortals, and that their relationship caused scandal throughout the kingdom. But here's where the story gets really interesting. The English barons weren't just upset about the king having a male lover, they were furious about how this relationship was disrupting the entire political system. Gaveston wasn't just Edward's favourite. He was essentially running the country while Edward ignored his royal duties. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their capitals that the King of England seemed more interested in his companion than in governing his kingdom. The situation became so extreme that in 1308, just 1 year into Edward's reign, the barons forced the king to exile Gaveston to Ireland. But Edward was so desperate to get his lover back that he negotiated with the Pope, bribed English nobles, and essentially traded away royal prerogatives to secure Gaveston's return. When Gaveston came back to England in 1309, Edward immediately restored all his titles and lands, proving that nothing had changed. Contemporary accounts describe the reunion between Edward and Gaveston in terms that shocked even medieval observers. The Chronicle of Lionheart reports that Edward received him with great joy, as if recovering a beloved brother. But the word they actually used was delectus, which in medieval Latin carried romantic connotations that would have been clear to educated readers. The relationship between Edward and Gaveston ultimately led to civil war. In 1311, the barons again forced Gaveston into exile, and when he returned without permission in 1312, they captured and executed him. Edward's reaction was immediate and devastating. He declared war on his own nobles, plunging England into years of conflict that would eventually cost him his throne and his life. But here's the really tragic part. Edward never learned from the disaster. After Gaveston's death, he immediately formed another intense relationship, this time with Hugh Despenser the Younger. And just like with Gaveston, Edward gave Despenser enormous power and wealth while ignoring the growing opposition from his nobles and his wife, Queen Isabella. The relationship with Despenser was even more politically destructive than the one with Gaveston. Contemporary sources describe how Edward would spend entire days with Despenser, neglecting state business and foreign policy. The Brute Chronicle reports that Edward loved Hugh Despenser more than any earthly man, and that this love brought sorrow to all England. By 1326, Edward's queen, Isabella, had fled to France and was raising an army to overthrow her own husband. When she invaded England, Edward's support collapsed almost immediately, partly because the English nobility was so tired of his favouritism toward male companions. Edward and Despenser fled together, but they were captured within months. Despenser was executed in one of the most brutal ways possible, and Edward was forced to abdicate in favour of his teenage son. Edward II died in Berkeley Castle in 1327, probably murdered on Isabella's orders. The symbolic irony of his death, supposedly killed with a red-hot poker inserted into his body, shows how his enemies wanted to punish him specifically for his sexual relationships. His forbidden love had literally cost him his kingdom and his life. Now let's jump forward about 3.5 centuries to a completely different kind of English king. William III came to the throne in 1689 not through inheritance but through invitation. The English Parliament had invited him to overthrow the Catholic James II and restore Protestant rule. But William brought with him secrets that would have scandalised the very people who had welcomed him as their liberator. William III was married to Mary VII, and together they were known as the joint monarchs who secured England's Protestant future and established the foundation for modern parliamentary democracy. But while Mary focused on domestic affairs, William spent most of his time with the small circle of handsome young Dutch nobles who had followed him to England. The most documented of William's relationships was with Arnold Joost van Keppel, whom William made the Earl of Albemarle despite the fact that Keppel was the son of a minor Dutch official with no claim to English nobility. Contemporary court observers noted that William would spend hours in private consultation with Keppel, supposedly discussing military strategy, but the nature of their relationship was obvious to anyone who observed them together. Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough and one of the most powerful women at court, wrote in her memoirs about William's extraordinary fondness for Keppel, and noted that the king seemed more concerned with his companion's welfare than with affairs of state. The Duchess was particularly scandalised by how William would publicly show affection toward Keppel in ways that she considered inappropriate for a married king. But here's what makes William's story so different from Edward III's. William was incredibly careful to maintain the appearance of proper royal behaviour while pursuing his personal relationships. Unlike Edward, who flaunted his favourites and ignored political consequences, William created a system where his relationships with men operated parallel to, rather than in conflict with, his royal duties. William's other well-documented relationship was with Hans Willem Bentinck, who became the Earl of Portland. Bentinck had been William's closest companion since childhood, and when William became King of England, Bentinck essentially became his private secretary, confidant, and what we might today call his chief of staff. Contemporary diplomatic correspondence shows that foreign ambassadors understood they needed to work through Bentinck to reach the king. The fascinating thing about William's relationships is how he managed to maintain them while being married to Mary, who was not only his wife but also his co-ruler. Court records suggest that Mary was fully aware of William's relationships with men and had essentially negotiated a private arrangement that allowed both of them to maintain their public roles while living separate personal lives. But this system came with its own costs. William became increasingly isolated and paranoid, trusting only his Dutch companions and alienating the English nobility who had brought him to power. His marriage to Mary was purely political. They had no children, and contemporary observers noted that they seemed more like business partners than spouses. The contrast between Edward II and William III is absolutely fascinating, because it shows two completely different strategies for managing forbidden relationships as king. Edward chose passion over politics and lost everything. William chose politics over passion and managed to keep his throne, but at the cost of becoming increasingly cold and isolated. What's really striking is how both men's relationships affected their effectiveness as rulers, just in opposite ways. Edward's emotional intensity and public favouritism created political chaos that ultimately destroyed his reign. William's careful discretion and emotional distance allowed him to maintain power, but made him unpopular and ineffective at building the kind of personal connections that effective monarchy required. Both stories reveal the impossible situation faced by English kings who couldn't or wouldn't conform to traditional expectations about royal masculinity and marriage. The system demanded public performance of heterosexual marriage and masculine authority, but it offered no legitimate space for authentic emotional connections that fell outside those boundaries. The tragedy in both cases is how these brilliant, complex men were forced to choose between personal authenticity and political survival. Edward chose authenticity and was destroyed. William chose survival and lived a life of careful performance and emotional restraint. But England wasn't the only kingdom where royal secrets shaped national destiny. Just across the Channel, the French court was developing its own elaborate systems for managing forbidden desire. creating some of the most sophisticated and scandalous royal relationships in European history. What we're about to discover about French kings will make even these English stories seem tame by comparison. France had always been different. While other European kingdoms struggled with the contradictions between royal duty and personal desire, the French court turned forbidden relationships into an art form. At Versailles and the palaces that came before it, elaborate systems of etiquette, ceremony, and carefully managed scandal allowed for relationships that would have been impossible anywhere else. But even by French standards, two royal brothers managed to shock an entire kingdom with their approach to love and power. Let's start with one of the most psychologically fascinating kings in French history. Louis XIV ruled for 33 years, from 1610 to 1643, but spent most of that time letting Cardinal Richelieu actually run the country, while he focused on what really interested him: beautiful young men and elaborate court ceremonies that allowed him to be close to them. Louis XIV was famous for being extremely shy, deeply religious, and completely uninterested in his wife, Anne of Austria. They were married for 23 years before producing their first child, the future Louis XIV, and court observers noted that the king seemed to find his marital duties deeply unpleasant. But what Louis lacked in enthusiasm for his wife, he made up for in his passionate friendships with handsome young noblemen. The most documented of Louis's relationships was with Henri Coiffier de Rouzay, Marquis de Cinq-Mars, a stunningly beautiful young man who joined the court when he was just 18. Cardinal Richelieu himself introduced Cinq-Mars to the king, apparently hoping to use the young man's influence to manage Louis's increasingly erratic behaviour. What Richelieu didn't expect was how completely Louis would become obsessed with his new favourite. Contemporary court memoirs describe the relationship between Louis and Cinq-Mars in terms that leave little doubt about its nature. The Duc de Saint-Simon wrote that the king could not bear to be separated from Cinq-Mars for even a few hours, and that Louis would become agitated and melancholy whenever his favourite was absent from court. More tellingly, Louis gave Cinq-Mars apartments directly adjacent to the royal chambers and established daily routines that ensured they would spend most of their time together. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Louis's relationship with Cinq-Mars wasn't just personal, it became a crucial element in French politics. Cinq-Mars used his influence over the king to build his own power base, eventually plotting against Cardinal Richelieu himself. When Richelieu discovered the plot in 1642, he faced an impossible choice: protect his own position by destroying the king's beloved favourite, or allow a conspiracy to succeed that could destabilise the entire kingdom. Richelieu chose to destroy Cinq-Mars, presenting Louis with evidence of treason that was impossible to ignore. The king's reaction reveals everything about the depth of his feelings. According to court records, Louis wept openly when he signed Cinq-Mars' death warrant, then locked himself in his chambers for days, refusing to see anyone. The execution of his favourite essentially broke Louis's spirit. He died less than a year later, many believe from grief and the stress of losing the person he loved most. But Louis XIII's story also reveals something fascinating about how French court culture accommodated relationships that couldn't be officially recognised. Louis created elaborate hunting parties, military reviews, and court ceremonies that were essentially designed to provide opportunities for intimate conversation and private time with his favourites. The entire court understood what was happening, but the formal structure of royal protocol provided cover for relationships that existed in plain sight. Now let's talk about Louis's nephew, Philippe I, Duke of Orléans, who took this French tradition of royal scandal to levels that shocked even the sophisticated courtiers of Versailles. Philippe, known as Monsieur, was the younger brother of Louis XIV, and he lived his entire life as an openly gay man in the most public court in Europe. and somehow he not only survived but thrived. Philippe I is one of the most extraordinary figures in European royal history because he completely rejected every convention about royal masculinity and got away with it. From childhood, he preferred women's clothing, makeup and jewellery. As an adult, he surrounded himself with male lovers, participated in elaborate cross-dressing parties, and conducted his relationships with men so openly that foreign ambassadors wrote detailed reports about them to their home governments. The most famous of Philippe's relationships was with Philippe de Lorraine, known as the Chevalier de Lorraine, a relationship so scandalous that it caused diplomatic incidents with other European courts. The Chevalier was not just Philippe's lover, but essentially his unofficial spouse, living in the royal palace, participating in state functions, and wielding enormous influence over French policy. Contemporary court memoirs by Elizabeth Charlotte, Philippe's second wife, provide incredible detail about this relationship. She wrote that Philippe loved the Chevalier more than any woman he had ever known, and that their relationship was the talk of every court in Europe. What makes her account so valuable is that Elizabeth Charlotte wasn't writing gossip. She was documenting her own lived experience as the wife of a man whose primary emotional relationship was with another man. But here's what makes Philippe's story so remarkable. Despite living completely outside conventional gender norms, he was one of the most successful military commanders of his generation. Philippe won crucial battles for France, including the Battle of Cassel in 1677, where he personally led cavalry charges while wearing elaborate makeup and jewellery. Enemy commanders reportedly didn't know whether to be terrified or confused by this flamboyant prince who fought like a demon, while looking like he was headed to a costume ball. The French court system that allowed Philippe to live so openly was incredibly sophisticated. Louis XIV, despite being one of the most absolute monarchs in European history, essentially created protected spaces for his brothers' relationships. Philippe had his own court at the Château de Saint-Cloud, where he could live exactly as he pleased. But this wasn't just royal indulgence, it was political calculation. By allowing Philippe to be openly different, Louis XIV solved several problems at once. He satisfied his brother's need for authenticity, prevented the kind of political conspiracies that had destroyed relationships between royal brothers in other kingdoms, and actually used Philippe's unconventional lifestyle as a diplomatic tool. Foreign courts never quite knew how to handle Philippe, giving France psychological advantages in negotiations. Court records from the period show how this system worked in practice. Philippe would appear at formal Versailles functions dressed in women's clothing, accompanied by the Chevalier de Lorraine, and everyone would simply pretend this was normal court protocol. Foreign ambassadors wrote confused reports back to their capitals, describing a French prince who defied every convention about royal behaviour, while remaining one of the most powerful and effective members of the royal family. But the psychological cost of this system was enormous for both Louis XIII and Philippe I. Louis's relationship with Cinq-Mars ultimately destroyed his emotional stability and may have hastened his death. Philippe, despite his apparent freedom, lived under constant pressure to prove his loyalty to his brother and the kingdom, knowing that his unconventional lifestyle made him vulnerable to political enemies. What's really fascinating is how both men used different strategies to navigate the same basic challenge: how to live authentically while maintaining royal power. Louis tried to hide his relationships within traditional court structures, and was ultimately destroyed when those relationships created political conflict. Philippe openly defied conventions, but did so within a system that his brother carefully controlled to prevent political consequences. Both stories reveal something profound about the relationship between authenticity and power in early modern Europe. The French court system was sophisticated enough to accommodate unconventional relationships, but only within very specific parameters that preserved royal authority and political stability. The tragedy is that both men paid enormous emotional cost for their strategies. Louis lived in constant anxiety about discovery and political consequences. Philippe lived with the knowledge that his freedom existed only at his brother's pleasure and could be withdrawn at any time. But France wasn't the only kingdom developing sophisticated approaches to these challenges. Across the Rhine, German princes were creating their own unique solutions to the problem of forbidden royal desire. What we're about to discover about Frederick the Great and Ludwig II will show us how German culture handled these relationships in ways that were both more intellectual and more tragic than anything we've seen so far. Germany in the 18th and 19th centuries was a completely different kind of stage for royal romance. Where French kings used elaborate court ceremonies and English monarchs struggled with political consequences, German princes turned to philosophy, art, and sheer romantic idealism to create spaces for forbidden love. But this intellectual approach came with its own unique tragedies, as two of the most brilliant rulers in German history would discover. Frederick the Great of Prussia might be the most psychologically complex king we've encountered so far. Here was a man who transformed Prussia into a major European power, revolutionized military strategy, and corresponded with Voltaire about Enlightenment philosophy. But beneath all that intellectual achievement was someone whose deepest emotional connections had been shaped by a trauma so severe that it affected his entire approach to love and power. Let's go back to 1730, when Frederick was just 18 years old and desperately trying to escape his father's brutal control. Frederick Wilhelm II was one of the most authoritarian kings in European history, a man who believed that princes should be soldiers first and human beings second. But young Frederick was interested in poetry, philosophy, and music, and he was also deeply in love with a young Prussian officer named Hans Hermann von Katter. Contemporary accounts describe Frederick and Katter as inseparable companions who shared intellectual interests and what court observers delicately called intimate friendship. They would spend hours discussing French literature, practicing music together, and planning Frederick's escape from his father's oppressive court. But when Frederick Wilhelm discovered their relationship, his reaction was swift and absolutely devastating. The king had Katter arrested for treason and sentenced to death. But here's the truly horrific part. Frederick Wilhelm forced his son to watch Katter's execution from his prison window. According to eyewitness accounts, when Katter saw Frederick at the window, he called out, "My dear Frederick, forgive me," before being beheaded. Frederick reportedly fainted and didn't speak for days afterward. This traumatic experience fundamentally shaped Frederick's entire approach to relationships for the rest of his life. When he became king in 1740, he created a court culture at Sanssouci Palace that was unlike anything else in Europe, a place where intellectual achievement and philosophical discussion provided cover for relationships that couldn't be acknowledged directly. Frederick's court attracted the most brilliant minds in Europe, including Voltaire, who lived at Sanssouci for several years. But French diplomatic records from the period reveal that this intellectual environment also provided space for Frederick's relationships with various young men, particularly his aide-de-camp and lifelong companion Michael Gabriel Fredersdorf. Fredersdorf wasn't noble-born. He started as Frederick's valet, but the king elevated him to positions of enormous trust and responsibility. Contemporary observers noted that Frederick would spend more time in private consultation with Fredersdorf than with his actual ministers. When Fredersdorf died in 1758, Frederick was reportedly inconsolable for months, writing in a letter to Voltaire that he had lost the friend of my heart. But here's what makes Frederick's story so fascinating. he managed to live authentically while building one of the most powerful military states in Europe. His court at Sanssouci became famous throughout Europe as a centre of Enlightenment culture, where philosophers, artists, and intellectuals gathered to discuss ideas that were revolutionary for their time. Frederick used this intellectual framework to create relationships that were based on shared ideas and cultural interests rather than just physical attraction. Frederick's approach was essentially to intellectualize forbidden desire, turning emotional connections into philosophical friendships that could be publicly celebrated and defended. His extensive correspondence with male friends is filled with references to classical models of same-sex friendship, particularly the relationships between philosophers in ancient Greece. He wasn't hiding his relationships, he was reframing them in terms that Enlightenment culture could accept and even admire. The tragic irony is that Frederick's intellectual approach ultimately left him emotionally isolated. By the end of his life, he had become known as the Great for his military and political achievements, but court observers described him as increasingly lonely and cynical about human connection. His strategy of intellectualizing emotion had protected him from his father's kind of brutality, but it had also distanced him from the kind of authentic intimacy he'd shared with Carter. Now let's jump forward about a century to a completely different kind of German ruler. Ludwig II of Bavaria took the opposite approach from Frederick. Instead of intellectualizing forbidden desire, he romanticized it to such an extreme that it completely overwhelmed his ability to function as a king. Ludwig II became King of Bavaria in 1864 at age 18, and from the very beginning, his approach to both love and power was pure romantic fantasy. While Frederick had used philosophy to create space for authentic relationships, Ludwig used fairy tale aesthetics and artistic obsession to escape from reality entirely. Ludwig's most famous relationship was with Richard Wagner, the composer, but this wasn't just artistic patronage, it was an all-consuming emotional obsession that shaped Ludwig's entire approach to being king. Contemporary accounts describe how Ludwig would attend Wagner's operas dozens of times, sometimes as the only audience member in the entire theatre. He would commission private performances where he and Wagner would be alone together, discussing not just music, but what court observers called deeply personal matters. The correspondence between Ludwig and Wagner, which still exists, reveals a relationship that was intensely romantic, even if it may not have been physically consummated. Ludwig's letters are filled with language like "my beloved friend," and the only one who truly understands my soul. Wagner, who was significantly older and more experienced, seemed to understand exactly how to manage Ludwig's obsessive personality to secure massive financial support for his artistic projects. But Ludwig's relationship with Wagner was just the beginning. Court records from the period document his relationships with various other men, including his aide-de-camp Prince Paul von Thurn and Taxis, and later with actors, servants, and stable hands. What's remarkable is how Ludwig seemed completely oblivious to the political consequences of these relationships. Unlike every other ruler we've discussed, Ludwig made no attempt to hide or manage his relationships strategically. He would promote his lovers to high positions in court, shower them with expensive gifts, and build elaborate architectural fantasies that were essentially shrines to romantic idealism. Neuschwanstein Castle, the fairy tale castle that inspired Disney's Sleeping Beauty castle, was basically Ludwig's attempt to create a physical environment where his romantic fantasies could exist without interference from political reality. Contemporary accounts describe Ludwig's behaviour as increasingly disconnected from the practical requirements of ruling Bavaria. He would spend entire nights in his castles, hosting elaborate dinner parties for one, himself, while imagining conversations with historical figures and literary characters. court officials reported that the king seemed more interested in the imaginary companions he created than in real relationships with actual people. The tragedy of Ludwig's story is how his romantic idealism gradually consumed his connection to reality. While Frederick had used intellectual frameworks to protect and nurture authentic relationships, Ludwig used romantic fantasy to escape from the possibility of real connection entirely. His relationships with actual people became increasingly brief and unsatisfying, because no real person could compete with the perfect romantic scenarios he imagined. By the 1880s, Ludwig had become so isolated and erratic that his own ministers declared him mentally unfit to rule. The official diagnosis was paranoid schizophrenia, but reading the historical records, it seems more like he had simply retreated so completely into romantic fantasy that he could no longer distinguish between his inner world and external reality. Ludwig's death in 1886 remains one of history's great mysteries. He was found dead in Lake Starnberg along with his psychiatrist, Dr. Bernhard von Gudden. The official ruling was suicide, but many historians believe Ludwig may have been murdered by political enemies who saw his erratic behaviour as a threat to Bavarian independence. The contrast between Frederick and Ludwig reveals two completely different strategies for handling forbidden desire in German culture. Frederick channeled his emotional needs into intellectual achievement and philosophical friendship, creating a sustainable but ultimately distant approach to human connection. Ludwig pursued absolute romantic authenticity, but did so in ways that were so disconnected from political and social reality that they ultimately destroyed his ability to function as either a king or a person. Both men were products of German Romanticism and Enlightenment culture, but they represent opposite extremes of how those intellectual movements could be applied to personal life. Frederick shows us the strengths and limitations of treating love as a philosophical problem. Ludwig shows us what happens when romantic idealism becomes so extreme that it replaces actual relationships with elaborate fantasies. What's really striking is how both men used their considerable resources and cultural sophistication to create alternatives to conventional royal marriage and succession, but neither found a sustainable path to authentic intimacy. Frederick's intellectual approach protected him but left him lonely. Ludwig's romantic approach allowed for intense emotion, but ultimately proved destructive. But these German examples were just part of a broader Northern European tradition of managing royal relationships with greater tolerance and sophistication than we've seen elsewhere. As we continue our journey, we're heading to Scandinavia, where the most progressive kingdoms in Europe were dealing with their own complex royal secrets. The stories of Gustaf III of Sweden and Christian VII of Denmark will show us how even the most enlightened societies of their time still forced their rulers to live impossible double lives. Scandinavia in the 18th century represented everything Enlightenment Europe aspired to become: rational, progressive, and tolerant. These northern kingdoms were pioneering reforms in everything from religious freedom to social welfare, creating societies that seemed centuries ahead of their time. But even in these supposedly enlightened realms, royal secrets remained just as dangerous and destructive as anywhere else. What we're about to discover about two Scandinavian kings will show you that progress and tolerance can be just as much of a prison as tradition and repression. Gustaf III of Sweden came to the throne in 1771 with a vision of transforming his kingdom into the cultural capital of Northern Europe. He was brilliant, artistic, and absolutely obsessed with French culture, which should have been our first clue about what kind of king he would become. Gustaf founded the Royal Opera, established the Swedish Academy, and turned Stockholm into a glittering centre of arts and literature. But behind all this cultural sophistication was a man whose personal life was becoming increasingly desperate and dangerous. Here's what makes Gustaf's story so compelling. Sweden in the 1770s was probably the most socially progressive kingdom in Europe. The Swedish parliament had real power, religious tolerance was expanding, and intellectual freedom was greater than almost anywhere else. Yet Gustaf, despite being an absolute monarch with enormous personal freedom, couldn't find a way to live authentically without risking his throne. The most documented of Gustaf's relationships was with Gustaf Maurits Armfelt, a young nobleman who became Gustaf's closest advisor, companion, and what court observers carefully called his intimate friend. Contemporary accounts describe how Gustaf would spend entire days with Armfelt, discussing everything from military strategy to theatrical productions, but observers noted that their conversations often continued long into the night in the king's private chambers. Baron Erich Magnus Steil von Holstein, the French ambassador to Sweden, wrote detailed reports back to Versailles describing Gustaf's court as unlike anything he had experienced elsewhere in Europe. Steil noted that Gustaf seemed more concerned with his companion's welfare than with matters of state, and that the relationship between Gustaf and Armfelt was the subject of constant speculation throughout Stockholm. But here's where Gustaf's story becomes really fascinating. He used his passion for theatre and cultural events to create opportunities for relationships that couldn't be acknowledged directly. Gustaf didn't just patronize the arts, he participated in theatrical productions, sometimes playing romantic roles opposite young male actors. Court records show that Gustaf would commission private performances where he could work closely with handsome performers, supposedly developing their artistic skills. The Swedish court during Gustaf's reign developed an elaborate culture of artistic collaboration that provided cover for relationships that existed in plain sight. Gustaf would host literary salons and cultural discussions that were essentially private parties where he could socialize intimately with young men who shared his interests. The entire Swedish nobility understood what was happening, but the framework of cultural and intellectual activity made these relationships socially acceptable in ways that direct romantic relationships wouldn't have been. But Gustaf's need for secrecy ultimately destroyed his effectiveness as a king. Contemporary accounts describe how he became increasingly paranoid about discovery, suspicious of his own courtiers, and isolated from the very people he needed to govern effectively. Swedish diplomatic records show that by the 1780s, Gustaf was making increasingly erratic political decisions, partly because he trusted only a very small circle of male companions who often had no political experience. The tragedy reached its climax in 1792, when Gustaf was assassinated at a masked ball at the Royal Opera House, the very institution he had created as a space for artistic and personal freedom. His assassin, Jakob Johan Ancastrom, was a disgruntled nobleman who opposed Gustaf's policies, but many historians believe the real motivation was the widespread resentment among Swedish nobles about Gustaf's favoritism toward his male companions. The irony is devastating. Gustaf was killed at a cultural event wearing a mask in the building that represented his greatest achievement in creating spaces for authentic self-expression. His attempt to use art and culture to create freedom for forbidden relationships ultimately led to his destruction. Now let's travel to Denmark, where another Scandinavian king was dealing with similar challenges in an even more tragic way. Christian VII came to the throne in 1766 at age 17, and from the very beginning, it was clear that something was profoundly wrong. What historians initially described as mental illness was actually something much more complex. A young man whose inability to conform to royal expectations was gradually destroying his sanity. Christian VII is one of the most heartbreaking figures in royal history, because he represented everything that was progressive about Scandinavian society, while simultaneously being destroyed by the limitations of that same system. Denmark in the 1760s was implementing radical social reforms, expanding civil liberties, and creating one of the most tolerant societies in Europe. Yet Christian, despite being the absolute monarch, couldn't find a way to live as his authentic self. The most documented relationship in Christian's life was with Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German physician who came to Denmark to treat the king's various ailments. But what started as a medical relationship quickly became something much more intimate and politically significant. Contemporary court observers noted that Christian seemed to recover from his depression and anxiety only when Struensee was present, and that the two men spent increasingly long periods in private consultation. Struensee's own writings, which still exist in Danish royal archives, describe his relationship with Christian in terms that suggest it went far beyond doctor-patient interaction. Struensee wrote about Christian's desperate need for understanding and his profound loneliness despite being surrounded by people who claimed to care for his welfare. More tellingly, Struensee described how Christian would become agitated and inconsolable whenever Struensee had to leave court for any extended period. But here's where the story becomes politically explosive. Struensee used his influence over Christian to implement radical social reforms that transformed Denmark almost overnight. Between 1770 and 1772, Struensee essentially ruled Denmark in Christian's name, abolishing censorship, ending judicial torture, improving conditions for peasants, and implementing religious tolerance policies that were decades ahead of their time. The relationship between Christian and Struensee created one of the most progressive governments in European history, but it also generated enormous political opposition. Danish nobles were outraged not just by the reforms, but by the obvious fact that their king was being controlled by a foreign physician who had no legal claim to political power. Contemporary accounts suggest that Christian's relationship with Struensee was the only period in his adult life when he seemed genuinely happy and emotionally stable. Court observers noted that the king's mental health improved dramatically during Struensee's influence, and that Christian seemed to have found someone who understood and accepted his unconventional nature. But the political situation became impossible to sustain. In 1772, Danish nobles organized a coup that resulted in Struensee's arrest and execution. Christian's reaction was immediate and devastating. He suffered what court physicians described as a complete mental breakdown and never fully recovered. For the remaining 36 years of his reign, Christian was essentially a figurehead, while others ruled Denmark in his name. The tragedy of Christian VII's story is how it reveals the limitations of even the most progressive societies when it came to royal authenticity. Denmark was implementing social reforms that wouldn't be seen elsewhere in Europe for decades. Yet the Danish system couldn't accommodate a king whose personal needs fell outside conventional expectations. What's really striking about both Gustaf III and Christian VII is how their stories show that cultural sophistication and political progressiveness don't automatically translate into personal freedom for rulers. Both men lived in societies that were more tolerant and enlightened than almost anywhere else in 18th century Europe. Yet both were ultimately destroyed by their inability to live authentically within the constraints of monarchy. Gustaf tried to use cultural activities and artistic patronage to create spaces for forbidden relationships, but the political pressures of maintaining those spaces ultimately isolated him from effective governance. Christian found authentic connection with Struensee, but the political backlash against their relationship destroyed both his emotional stability and his ability to rule. Both stories reveal something profound about the relationship between social progress and individual freedom. Scandinavian society in the 18th century was pioneering reforms that expanded liberty and tolerance for ordinary citizens, but those same societies still demanded that their kings perform traditional roles that left no room for personal authenticity. The psychological cost for both men was enormous. Gustaf became increasingly paranoid and isolated, ultimately dying violently at the hands of subjects who resented his personal choices. Christian suffered a mental breakdown so severe that he spent the last 36 years of his life in a state of partial disconnection from reality. But even as Scandinavian progressiveness was failing its own rulers, the vast Russian Empire was developing entirely different approaches to these same challenges. Next, we're entering a world where absolute power created possibilities that didn't exist anywhere else. A realm where two of the most powerful rulers in human history found ways to live authentically that would shock even our sophisticated Scandinavian kings. The stories of Peter the Great and Alexander the Great will show us how unlimited authority could be both liberation and its own unique form of prison. Into the vast expanse of Russia, where power meant something completely different from anything we've seen so far. When you controlled the largest empire on Earth, when your word was literally law across 11 time zones, when millions of people lived and died at your pleasure, what did forbidden desire even mean? Two Russian rulers discovered that absolute power could create unprecedented freedom for authentic relationships, but it also brought unique psychological pressures that would ultimately prove just as destructive as the constraints faced by their Western counterparts. Peter the Great transformed Russia from a medieval backwater into a European superpower, but his most radical innovation wasn't military or political, it was personal. When Peter came to power in 1682, Russian society was still fundamentally medieval, with strict Orthodox Christian traditions that were even more conservative than Western European Christianity. Yet Peter used his absolute authority to create a court culture that was more permissive than anything in Paris or London. The key to understanding Peter's story is realizing that he didn't just rule Russia. He essentially reinvented what it meant to be Russian. When Peter decided that Russia needed to become Western and modern, he changed everything from the calendar to the alphabet to the way noblemen dressed. And in the process, he created space for relationships that would have been impossible under traditional Russian Orthodox culture. Peter's most documented relationship was with Alexander Menshikov, a young man from a humble background who became one of the most powerful figures in Russian history. What makes this relationship so fascinating is how Peter elevated Menshikov from essentially a street vendor to prince, field marshal and governor of St. Petersburg. Contemporary accounts describe their relationship in terms that leave little doubt about its intimate nature. The Saxon diplomat Johann Georg Korb, who lived at Peter's court, wrote detailed observations about the relationship between the Tsar and Menshikov. Korb noted that Peter could not bear to be separated from Menshikov even for short periods, and that the young man shared the Tsar's private chambers and accompanied him everywhere. More tellingly, Korb observed that Peter would become visibly agitated when Menshikov was absent, and that their reunions were marked by displays of affection that surprised foreign observers. But here's what makes Peter's story so different from every other ruler we've discussed. He didn't hide these relationships or try to manage them strategically. Peter created an entirely new Russian court culture, where his personal preferences became the standard for acceptable behavior. If the Tsar openly favored handsome young men, then that became normal court protocol. Peter's approach was essentially to use his absolute power to normalize relationships that would have been scandalous elsewhere. He established new court ceremonies, social customs, and even architectural spaces that accommodated his lifestyle. The Winter Palace and Peterhof were designed with elaborate private apartments where Peter could entertain small groups of male companions away from formal court functions. Russian Orthodox Church records from the period show how Peter managed religious opposition to his lifestyle. Unlike Western European rulers who had to negotiate with independent church authorities, Peter essentially controlled the Russian Orthodox Church directly. When church leaders objected to his relationships or lifestyle choices, Peter simply replaced them with more compliant clergy. His absolute authority extended even to religious doctrine and moral instruction. The relationship between Peter and Menshikov lasted for over 20 years and became one of the most politically significant partnerships in Russian history. Menshikov wasn't just Peter's favourite, he was his closest advisor, military commander, and essentially his unofficial co-ruler. When Peter travelled to Western Europe to study military and naval technology, Menshikov accompanied him, and foreign courts learned to treat Menshikov as Peter's official representative. But the psychological pressure of maintaining absolute power while living authentically took an enormous toll on Peter. Contemporary accounts describe him as increasingly paranoid, violent, and unpredictable as he aged. The Swedish diplomat Karl Piper wrote that Peter seemed torn between his desire for personal freedom and the impossible burden of ruling an empire that demanded constant vigilance and control. The tragedy of Peter's story becomes apparent when you look at what happened to his relationships under the pressure of maintaining absolute authority. His closeness with Menshikov gradually became corrupted by the realities of power. Menshikov became wealthy and influential, but also increasingly corrupt and politically dangerous. Peter found himself in the impossible position of loving someone who was also a potential threat to his empire. By the end of Peter's reign, his relationship with Menshikov had become a source of political instability rather than personal satisfaction. Peter died in 1725, possibly poisoned, and Menshikov was exiled within 2 years. The very system Peter had created to protect his authentic relationships ultimately consumed them. Now let's jump forward about 75 years to another Russian ruler who faced similar challenges with completely different results. Alexander III came to the throne in 1801 under traumatic circumstances. His father, Paul I, had been assassinated in a palace coup that Alexander may have known about in advance. This psychological burden shaped everything about Alexander's approach to both power and personal relationships. Alexander is one of the most psychologically complex rulers in European history. He was brilliant, mystical, and deeply troubled by the moral contradictions of absolute power. But he was also a man whose deepest emotional connections were with other men, and his struggle to reconcile these different aspects of his personality affected not just his personal life, but the entire course of European history. The most documented of Alexander's relationships was with Prince Adam Jerzy Czartoryski, a Polish nobleman who became Alexander's closest friend, advisor, and what contemporary observers called his beloved companion. Their relationship began when they were both young men and continued throughout Alexander's reign, despite the fact that Poland and Russia were often political enemies. Czartoryski's own memoirs, published after Alexander's death, provide incredible detail about their relationship. He describes Alexander as someone who needed constant emotional support and understanding, and who found it difficult to trust anyone outside a very small circle of male friends. Czartoryski wrote that Alexander would spend hours discussing not just political strategy, but his deepest fears and philosophical questions about the nature of power and moral responsibility. But what makes Alexander's story so compelling is how his personal relationships became intertwined with some of the most important events in European history. Alexander's emotional dependence on Czartoryski influenced Russian foreign policy toward Poland throughout the Napoleonic Wars. His close relationships with various military advisors affected Russian strategy during the 1812 invasion and the subsequent campaigns that ultimately defeated Napoleon. Contemporary diplomatic records show that European leaders learned to work through Alexander's male favourites to influence Russian policy. The Austrian foreign minister Clemens von Metternich wrote detailed reports describing how Alexander's emotional relationships affected his political decision-making. Metternich noted that Alexander seemed incapable of making important decisions without consulting his intimate circle of male companions. The psychological pressure on Alexander was enormous, because he was simultaneously trying to be an Orthodox Christian ruler, a military commander during the largest war in European history, and an authentic human being with complex emotional needs. Russian court records describe Alexander as increasingly mystical and religiously obsessed as his reign progressed, apparently trying to reconcile his personal life with his understanding of Christian morality. Alexander's relationship with another close companion, Prince Pyotr Volkonsky, reveals how these psychological pressures affected his ability to govern effectively. Volkonsky served as Alexander's aide-de-camp for over 15 years, and contemporary accounts describe their relationship as intensely close and emotionally dependent. But diplomatic observers noted that Alexander's reliance on Volkonsky sometimes prevented him from receiving accurate information about military and political situations. The most telling evidence about Alexander's psychological state comes from his behaviour after the defeat of Napoleon in 1814. Instead of celebrating his victory, Alexander became increasingly religious and withdrawn, spending more and more time with mystical advisors and less time governing the empire. Foreign diplomats reported that the Tsar seemed overwhelmed by the moral burden of his power and unable to enjoy the personal relationships that had sustained him earlier in his reign. Alexander died mysteriously in 1825 while travelling in the south of Russia, possibly from typhus, but possibly from depression and exhaustion. His death triggered the Decembrist revolt, partly because his emotional dependence on a small circle of male companions had prevented him from establishing clear succession plans or building broader political support. Both Peter and Alexander show us how absolute power could create unprecedented freedom for forbidden relationships, but at enormous psychological cost. Peter used his authority to completely reshape Russian culture around his personal preferences, but the effort of maintaining absolute control ultimately corrupted the relationships he was trying to protect. Alexander found authentic emotional connections within the constraints of autocracy, but the pressure of reconciling personal needs with imperial responsibility gradually destroyed his mental stability. What's really striking is how both men's personal relationships became inseparable from their effectiveness as rulers. Peter's closeness with Menshikov influenced Russian military strategy and foreign policy for decades. Alexander's emotional dependence on his male companions affected the course of the Napoleonic Wars and the subsequent European peace settlement. But Russia's approach to these challenges was just one model among many in European royal culture. As we continue our journey, we're heading to the Iberian Peninsula, where Spanish kings developed yet another approach to managing forbidden desire, one that involves some of the most powerful and wealthy royal courts in European history, but also some of the most tragic personal outcomes. The secrets of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty will show us how even unlimited wealth and political power couldn't protect rulers from the psychological cost of living impossible double lives. Spain in the 17th century controlled an empire so vast that the sun literally never set on Spanish territory. Gold and silver poured in from the Americas, making the Spanish crown the wealthiest in human history. The Habsburg kings of Spain commanded resources that made other European rulers look like minor nobles. Yet all that wealth and power couldn't buy them the one thing they desperately needed: the freedom to love authentically. What we're about to discover about the final Spanish Habsburgs reveals how even unlimited riches and absolute authority can become a prison when combined with rigid Catholic orthodoxy and the crushing weight of dynastic expectations. Philip IV became King of Spain in 1621 at age 16, inheriting an empire that stretched from Peru to the Philippines. He was handsome, intelligent, and passionate about the arts, commissioning works from Velázquez, supporting the theatre, and turning the Spanish court into one of the most culturally sophisticated in Europe. But beneath all that golden magnificence was a man whose deepest emotional needs could never be officially acknowledged. The Spanish Habsburg court was fundamentally different from anything we've seen so far, because it operated under the direct scrutiny of the Spanish Inquisition. While French kings could play with gender roles and German princes could indulge in philosophical friendships, Spanish rulers lived under constant surveillance by church officials, who had the power to investigate and punish any behaviour deemed morally suspicious. This created a uniquely oppressive environment for any king whose desires fell outside orthodox Catholic teaching. Philip's most documented relationship was with Gaspar de Guzman, Count Duke of Olivares, who served as Philip's chief minister for over 20 years. But this wasn't just a political partnership. Contemporary court observers noted an intimacy between the two men that went far beyond normal royal ministerial relationships. The Venetian ambassador, Alvise Contarini, wrote detailed reports describing how Philip and Olivares would spend entire days together in private consultation, often discussing matters that had nothing to do with state business. What makes their relationship so fascinating is how it had to operate within the rigid protocols of Spanish court ceremony. Unlike other European courts where favourites could be openly celebrated, Philip and Olivares had to conduct their relationship through elaborate formal procedures that provided cover for intimate connection. They created new court positions, ceremonial duties, and administrative routines that ensured they could spend time together while maintaining the appearance of proper royal protocol. Spanish court records from the period show how this system worked in practice. Philip would require Olivares to attend him during elaborate dressing ceremonies that could last for hours, participate in private hunting expeditions that excluded other courtiers, and join him for prayer sessions that contemporary observers noted seemed to involve more conversation than actual religious devotion. The entire Spanish court understood what was happening, but the formal structure of Catholic monarchy provided necessary cover. But the psychological cost of maintaining this elaborate performance was enormous. Contemporary accounts describe Philip as increasingly melancholy and withdrawn as his reign progressed. The French ambassador, François de Bassompierre, wrote that Philip seemed burdened by the weight of maintaining appearances, and that his public persona became increasingly artificial and distant from his private self. The relationship between Philip and Olivares ultimately became politically destructive because it was so emotionally intense and exclusive. Spanish nobles resented Olivares' extraordinary influence over the king, and foreign diplomats learned that they had to work through Olivares to reach Philip on any important matter. When Olivares finally fell from power in 1643, partly due to military failures but also because of growing resentment about his relationship with the king, Philip was reportedly devastated for months. But Philip's story also reveals something crucial about how the Spanish system handled forbidden royal desire, through artistic patronage and cultural sophistication. Philip commissioned hundreds of paintings, many featuring beautiful young men in mythological or religious settings. His court became famous throughout Europe for theatrical productions that often involved cross-dressing, gender ambiguity, and what contemporary observers called morally questionable themes. The genius of Philip's approach was using Catholic artistic tradition to create space for forbidden desire. By commissioning religious paintings that featured beautiful young male saints and angels, Philip could surround himself with images that satisfied his aesthetic preferences while remaining technically orthodox. Spanish church authorities couldn't object to paintings of Saint Sebastian or the Archangel Michael, even when those figures were clearly chosen for their physical beauty rather than their spiritual significance. Now let's turn to one of the most tragic figures in European royal history. Charles II, the last Spanish Habsburg king, inherited all the wealth and power of his predecessors, but also the devastating genetic consequences of 2 centuries of royal inbreeding. His story reveals how even the most sophisticated systems for managing royal authenticity could be overwhelmed by psychological and physical disabilities that made normal human relationships nearly impossible. Charles II became king in 1665 at age 4, but he was so physically and mentally impaired that many courtiers doubted he would survive to adulthood. The Habsburg practice of marrying close relatives to keep wealth and power within the family had created a genetic disaster. Charles suffered from multiple disabilities, including severe learning difficulties, physical deformities, and what court physicians described as profound melancholy and emotional instability. But here's what makes Charles's story so heartbreaking. Despite his disabilities, he desperately craved emotional connection and authentic relationships. Court records describe how Charles would become attached to various male courtiers and servants, forming intense emotional bonds that worried his advisors and embarrassed his family. The Duke of Mara, writing in his court memoirs, described Charles as having the emotional needs of a child but the desires of a man, creating situations that were both tragic and scandalous. Charles's most documented relationship was with Fernando de Valenzuela, a minor nobleman who rose to become one of the most powerful figures in Spain through his influence over the king. Contemporary accounts describe how Charles would become agitated and inconsolable when Valenzuela was absent from court, and how he showered his favourite with titles and wealth that far exceeded what anyone of Valenzuela's background could normally expect. The Spanish Inquisition records from this period reveal how church authorities handled Charles's relationships. Unlike with previous kings, the Inquisition seemed genuinely unsure whether Charles's behaviour constituted moral sin or was simply the result of his mental disabilities. Church officials wrote detailed reports trying to determine whether someone with Charles's limited mental capacity could be held responsible for relationships that violated Catholic teaching. What's really striking about Charles's story is how his emotional neediness became intertwined with Spanish political decline. By the 1680s, Spain was losing territory, facing economic crisis, and watching other European powers surpass Spanish influence. Yet Charles seemed more interested in his personal relationships than in the desperate political situation facing his empire. Foreign diplomats wrote shocked reports about Charles's court, describing a king who would publicly weep when his favourites disappointed him, throw tantrums when courtiers didn't pay enough attention to him, and make important political decisions based on the advice of whichever young man currently held his affection. The French ambassador, Antoine de Gramont, wrote that Charles seemed incapable of distinguishing between personal desire and state policy. The tragedy reached its climax when Charles died in 1700 without producing an heir, ending the Spanish Habsburg dynasty and triggering the War of Spanish Succession that consumed Europe for over a decade. His will, which left the Spanish Empire to Philip of Anjou, was apparently influenced by his final favourite, a French-educated courtier who convinced Charles that French rule would be better for Spain. Both Philip and Charles II reveal how the Spanish system created unique challenges for royal authenticity. The combination of enormous wealth, absolute power, and rigid Catholic orthodoxy meant that Spanish kings could commission great art, build magnificent palaces, and command vast empires, but they couldn't find sustainable ways to live authentic emotional lives. Philip's story shows how even the most sophisticated cultural and artistic strategies ultimately couldn't compensate for the psychological pressure of maintaining elaborate performances of orthodox behaviour. Charles's story reveals how genetic and psychological disabilities could make authentic relationships nearly impossible, even when unlimited resources were available to support them. What's really striking is how both men's personal struggles affected the Spanish Empire's political effectiveness. Philip's emotional dependence on Olivares contributed to military disasters and economic decline. Charles's inability to form stable relationships or produce heirs ultimately ended the Habsburg dynasty and triggered European war. The Spanish Habsburg experience shows us the ultimate limitations of wealth and power when it comes to personal authenticity. These men controlled more resources than almost any rulers in human history, yet they couldn't buy their way out of the fundamental human need for genuine emotional connection. But even as the Spanish Habsburgs were struggling with the constraints of Catholic orthodoxy, other parts of Europe were developing entirely different approaches to royal relationships. Just across the Mediterranean, Italian princes were creating some of the most sophisticated and permissive court cultures in European history, turning forbidden desire into political strategy and artistic achievement. The stories of Cesare Borgia and Francesco de Medici will show us how Italian Renaissance culture created possibilities that were literally unimaginable in the rigid Spanish court. Renaissance Italy was where all the rules changed. While Spanish kings suffocated under Catholic orthodoxy and French monarchs performed elaborate ceremonies to hide forbidden relationships, Italian princes did something revolutionary. They turned scandal into strategy. In the fragmented world of Italian city-states, where political survival depended on cunning rather than tradition, two rulers discovered that forbidden desire could actually become a source of power rather than weakness. Their stories will show you how Italian genius transformed what everywhere else was seen as dangerous vulnerability into sophisticated political and cultural advantage. Cesare Borgia stepped onto the Italian political stage in the 1490s with every possible advantage and one enormous liability. As the son of Pope Alexander VI, he had the backing of the most powerful institution in Europe. As a brilliant military strategist, he was conquering territory across central Italy and building what looked like an unstoppable political machine. But Cesare was also living completely outside conventional moral boundaries, and in Renaissance Italy, that actually made him more dangerous, not less. Here's what makes Cesare's story so extraordinary. He weaponized his reputation for moral transgression. While other European rulers tried to hide their forbidden relationships, Cesare flaunted them as proof of his sophistication and power. He understood that in the complex world of Italian politics, being unpredictable and morally intimidating could be more valuable than being respectable. Contemporary accounts describe Cesare's court as unlike anything else in Europe. The Florentine diplomat Niccolò Machiavelli, who spent considerable time observing Cesare's operations, wrote detailed reports describing a court where beautiful young men held official positions as companions, advisors, and secretaries, but where everyone understood their real function was to provide intimate companionship for the prince. Machiavelli's correspondence reveals his fascination with how Cesare used these relationships strategically. In a letter to the Florentine government dated 1503, Machiavelli wrote that Cesare surrounds himself with beautiful young men not out of weakness, but as a demonstration of his power to take whatever he desires. This wasn't hidden vice, it was public display of absolute authority. But here's where Cesare's approach gets really sophisticated. He used his relationships with men as a form of diplomatic signalling. When foreign ambassadors came to negotiate with Cesare, they were deliberately confronted with a court that challenged every assumption about proper princely behaviour. Cesare would conduct serious political negotiations while surrounded by handsome young companions, essentially using his personal life to intimidate and confuse his opponents. The Venetian ambassador, Francesco Capello, wrote shocked reports back to Venice describing how Cesare would appear at formal diplomatic functions, dressed in elaborate silk costumes, wearing jewellery and perfume, accompanied by young men who were clearly more than mere courtiers. But Capello also noted that this apparently effeminate display was combined with casual references to recent executions, territorial conquests, and military threats that made clear Cesare's underlying ruthlessness. Cesare's most documented relationship was with Michelotto Corella, a young Spanish soldier who became Cesare's closest companion, military lieutenant, and what contemporary sources called his most intimate advisor. But unlike other royal favourites who gained influence through private emotional connection, Corella's power was public and official. Cesare made him captain of his personal guard, gave him command authority over other officers, and used him as his representative in negotiations with other Italian princes. What's really remarkable is how Cesare managed to maintain these relationships while operating in the intensely Catholic environment of papal politics. His father was literally the Pope, yet Cesare conducted his personal life in ways that would have scandalized any other Catholic court. The key was the unique nature of Renaissance papal politics, where spiritual authority and temporal power were so intertwined that conventional moral rules became negotiable. Papal court records from Alexander VI's reign show how this system worked. Church officials would write formal reports describing Cesare's household arrangements and personal staff, using language that was technically neutral but clearly understood by everyone involved. The Vatican had essentially created a bureaucratic language for acknowledging relationships that couldn't be officially recognized. But Cesare's strategy of turning scandal into strength ultimately became his downfall. When his father died in 1503 and the new Pope Julius II proved hostile to the Borgia family, Cesare discovered that his reputation for moral transgression made him vulnerable to charges of corruption and impropriety. The very qualities that had made him intimidating and powerful under his father's protection became liabilities when that protection disappeared. Cesare died in 1507 at age 31, killed in a minor military skirmish in Navarre. But his approach to managing forbidden relationships influenced Italian court culture for centuries. He had proved that unconventional personal behaviour could be turned into political advantage, setting a precedent that other Italian princes would follow and refine. Now let's jump forward about 70 years to Florence, where another Italian prince was taking Cesare's innovations in completely different directions. Francesco III de Medici became Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1574, inheriting not just political power, but also the most sophisticated artistic and cultural establishment in Europe. And Francesco used that cultural apparatus to create what was essentially a Renaissance laboratory for exploring forbidden relationships. Francesco's court was famous throughout Europe for its scientific experiments, artistic innovations, and intellectual sophistication. But what foreign observers didn't fully understand was that Francesco was also experimenting with new forms of personal relationship that challenged every assumption about royal behaviour and masculine authority. The most documented of Francesco's relationships was with Bianca Capello, a Venetian noblewoman who became his mistress and eventually a second wife. But court records reveal that Francesco's emotional life was far more complex than this official relationship suggested. Florentine archives contain extensive correspondence describing Francesco's intimate friendships with various young men, including scholars, artists, and members of his court. What makes Francesco's story so fascinating is how he used the Medici tradition of artistic patronage to create legitimate reasons for intimate relationships with young men. Francesco would commission scholars to live in the Pitti Palace for extended periods, supposedly to work on intellectual projects. But court observers noted that these arrangements often involved far more personal interaction than scholarly work required. The Venetian ambassador Giovanni Michiel wrote detailed reports describing Francesco's court as operating by completely different rules from other European royal establishments. Michiel noted that Francesco would spend entire days with young male scholars, supposedly discussing natural philosophy and scientific experiments, but that these sessions often continued late into the night in Francesco's private apartments. Francesco's approach was essentially to intellectualize and aestheticize relationships that couldn't be acknowledged directly. By framing intimate connections as scholarly collaboration or artistic patronage, Francesco created a system where forbidden desire could be expressed through socially acceptable activities. But here's where Francesco's story becomes really innovative. He used his scientific interests to create new models for understanding human relationships. Francesco corresponded with scholars throughout Europe about theories of friendship, emotional connection, and what Renaissance thinkers called spiritual affinity. He was essentially using cutting-edge intellectual work to develop frameworks that could accommodate his authentic personal needs. The Medici archives contain hundreds of letters between Francesco and various male scholars, discussing topics like the nature of intimate friendship and the spiritual dimensions of masculine companionship. These weren't abstract philosophical discussions. They were Francesco's attempts to create intellectual justification for relationships that conventional society couldn't recognize. Francesco's court became famous for hosting philosophical salons where participants would discuss classical models of same-sex friendship, particularly the relationships described in Plato's dialogues. But these weren't just academic exercises. They were essentially support groups for men who were trying to understand and justify their own unconventional emotional needs. What's really remarkable about both Cesare and Francesco is how they used uniquely Italian institutions, papal politics and Medici patronage, to create spaces for authentic relationships that would have been impossible elsewhere in Europe. Cesare used the moral flexibility of Renaissance papal politics to turn scandal into intimidation. Francesco used Medici intellectual tradition to turn forbidden desire into scholarly investigation. Both men show us how Italian Renaissance culture's emphasis on individual achievement and cultural innovation could create unprecedented opportunities for personal authenticity. But both also reveal the psychological costs of living constantly at the cutting edge of what society could accept. Cesare's aggressive approach ultimately made him too many enemies and left him vulnerable when political circumstances changed. Francesco's intellectual approach protected him from direct criticism, but also isolated him in an increasingly artificial world of theoretical relationships that may have satisfied his mind more than his heart. The Italian Renaissance experience shows us something crucial about the relationship between cultural sophistication and personal freedom. In societies that valued innovation, artistic achievement, and intellectual exploration, there were more opportunities to create new models for forbidden relationships. But those opportunities came with their own unique pressures and limitations. Both Cesare and Francesco died relatively young, Cesare at 31, Francesco at 46, and neither established lasting dynasties or political systems that could preserve the innovations they had created. Their approaches to forbidden relationships were too dependent on their personal charisma and cultural moment to be sustainable beyond their own lifetimes. But the Italian model of turning forbidden desire into cultural and political advantage would influence European court culture for centuries. As we continue our journey, we're heading to a part of Europe where rulers face completely different challenges. Regions where political instability and foreign domination created their own unique opportunities and constraints for royal authenticity. The stories of Eastern European kings will show us how political uncertainty could sometimes create more space for forbidden relationships than all the wealth and sophistication of Western courts. Eastern Europe presented a completely different puzzle for royal authenticity. Here was a region caught between the Ottoman Empire to the south, rising Russian power to the east, and aggressive Swedish expansion to the north. Kings in Poland, Hungary, and the surrounding territories weren't dealing with the comfortable stability of Western European monarchies. They were fighting for survival in an endless series of wars, invasions, and political crises. But this constant instability created unexpected opportunities for personal freedom that were impossible in the rigid court systems we've explored so far. Stephen Batory came to the Polish throne in 1576, not through inheritance, but through election, a uniquely Eastern European approach to monarchy that changed everything about how royal power operated. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was the largest country in Europe, but its kings had to be chosen by the nobility, confirmed by parliament, and constantly negotiated with fractious regional leaders who could withdraw their support at any time. This created a fascinating paradox. Stephen had less absolute authority than any other European king, but also more personal freedom. Here's what makes Stephen's story so compelling. Because Polish kings had to constantly prove their worthiness through military success and political skill, there was less focus on their personal behaviour and more emphasis on their effectiveness as leaders. Stephen could live more authentically than rulers who inherited their thrones, precisely because his authority came from performance rather than bloodline. Stephen's most documented relationship was with Jan Zamoyski, who became his closest advisor, military commander, and what contemporary sources called his most trusted companion. But unlike the relationships we've seen in other European courts, the connection between Stephen and Zamoyski was openly celebrated by the Polish nobility because it was so obviously beneficial to the kingdom's military and political success. The Venetian diplomat Gianfrancesco Morosini wrote detailed reports about Stephen's court that reveal how different the Polish system was from other European monarchies. Morosini noted that Stephen and Zamoyski would spend entire campaigns together, sharing tents, planning strategy, and conducting what he called intimate military consultations that often had little to do with actual warfare, but rather than scandalizing the Polish nobles, this close partnership was seen as evidence of the king's commitment to effective governance. What's really remarkable is how the constant military pressure facing Poland actually protected Stephen's personal relationships rather than constraining them. Because the kingdom was always under threat from the Ottomans, Russians, or Swedes, the Polish nobility cared more about whether their king could win battles than whether he conformed to conventional standards of royal behaviour. Stephen's military campaigns against the Russians reveal how his relationship with Zamoyski became a crucial element in Polish military strategy. Contemporary battle accounts describe how Stephen and Zamoyski would coordinate cavalry charges, share command decisions, and maintain what military observers called unprecedented personal cooperation between a king and his general. The siege of Pskov in 1581, where Stephen's forces nearly captured one of Russia's most important cities, was largely successful because of the intimate coordination between Stephen and Zamoyski. But here's where Stephen's story becomes really fascinating. The Polish elective system meant that his personal relationships could become diplomatic tools in ways that were impossible for hereditary monarchs. When Stephen was courting the Polish nobility before his election, his close partnership with Zamoyski was actually used as evidence of his ability to form the kind of personal alliances that effective Polish kingship required. The Polish parliamentary records from Stephen's reign show how this system worked in practice. Instead of hiding his close relationships with male companions, Stephen would publicly acknowledge them as evidence of his ability to inspire loyalty and trust. The Polish concept of bratnia przyjaźń, brotherly friendship, provided cultural framework for relationships that would have been problematic in more rigid monarchical systems. Stephen's approach was essentially to turn political instability into personal opportunity. Because he had to constantly prove his worthiness as king, he could justify any relationship that contributed to his effectiveness as a military and political leader. His closeness with Zamoyski and other male companions was presented not as personal indulgence, but as evidence of his ability to build the coalitions and partnerships that Polish kingship required. Now let's jump forward about 50 years to another Polish king who took this Eastern European approach in completely different directions. Władysław III inherited a more stable, but still challenging political situation, and he used that relative stability to create one of the most tolerant and culturally sophisticated courts in 17th century Europe. Władysław became king in 1632, inheriting the throne from his father Sigismund III, but he ruled a Poland-Lithuania that was still constantly threatened by foreign enemies and internal religious divisions. Catholics, Orthodox Christians, Protestants, and Jews all lived within the Commonwealth's borders, creating religious diversity that was unthinkable in most European kingdoms. And Władysław used this diversity to create space for personal relationships that would have been impossible in more orthodox Catholic or Protestant courts. The most documented of Władysław's relationships was with Jerzy Ossoliński, a brilliant diplomat and military commander who became not just the king's closest advisor, but his constant companion for over 15 years. Contemporary accounts describe their relationship in terms that clearly indicate intimate emotional connection. But unlike similar relationships in Western European courts, this connection was celebrated rather than hidden. French diplomatic records from the period provide incredible detail about Władysław's court culture. The French ambassador, Claude de Mehmed, wrote that Władysław had created a court unlike any other in Europe, where merit and personal loyalty matter more than birth or conventional propriety. Mehmed noted that Władysław would openly display affection toward male companions in ways that would have scandalized Versailles or Madrid, but that seemed perfectly normal in the context of Polish political culture. What's really striking about Władysław's approach is how he used Poland's religious diversity to create protection for unconventional relationships. Because the Commonwealth officially tolerated multiple religious traditions, Władysław could argue that his court should also tolerate multiple approaches to personal relationship and emotional connection. He essentially turned Poland's political necessity for religious tolerance into cultural space for personal authenticity. Władysław's relationship with Ossoliński became legendary throughout Europe, partly because it was so obviously beneficial to Polish interests. When Ossoliński served as Władysław's representative in peace negotiations with Sweden, his intimate knowledge of the king's thinking and complete personal loyalty made him an incredibly effective diplomat. Foreign courts learned that they needed to convince Ossoliński before they could hope to influence Władysław, and this personal dynamic actually enhanced Polish diplomatic effectiveness. But here's where both Stephen and Władysław's stories reveal something crucial about Eastern European political culture. The constant external threats facing Poland created a form of national solidarity that was more important than conventional moral standards. Both kings could live more authentically than their Western European counterparts, precisely because Polish survival depended on effective leadership rather than traditional royal performance. The Ottoman siege of Vienna in 1683, which happened after both kings had died but which their policies had helped prepare for, shows how this Eastern European approach to leadership ultimately contributed to European history. The military traditions and alliance systems that Stephen and Władysław had built, partly through their personal relationships and unconventional leadership styles, helped create the coalition that ultimately stopped Ottoman expansion into Europe. What's really remarkable about both men is how they managed to turn political weakness into personal strength. Because Polish kings had less absolute authority than Western European monarchs, they had to be more authentic and personally engaging to maintain their positions. This created opportunities for genuine relationships that were impossible in courts, where royal behaviour was rigidly prescribed by tradition and protocol. But the psychological cost was still enormous. Both Stephen and Wladyslaw died relatively young, Stephen at 53, Wladyslaw at 52, and contemporary accounts suggest that the constant pressure of maintaining leadership in such a politically unstable environment ultimately exhausted them. The freedom they gained from political instability came at the cost of constant stress and uncertainty. The Eastern European experience shows us something profound about the relationship between political systems and personal authenticity. In stable, traditional monarchies, kings had enormous power but little personal freedom. In unstable, elective systems like Poland-Lithuania, kings had more personal freedom but faced constant threats to their political survival. Both Stephen and Wladyslaw represent a unique model of royal authenticity that was only possible in the specific political and cultural context of Eastern Europe. Their stories show us how political necessity could sometimes create more space for forbidden relationships than all the wealth and cultural sophistication of Western courts. But these Eastern European innovations were happening at the same time that the great Byzantine Empire was finally collapsing, taking with it a 1,000-year tradition of imperial grandeur and its own unique approaches to forbidden royal relationships. As we approach the end of our journey through royal secrets, we're about to discover some of the most tragic and dramatic stories yet. The final emperors of Byzantium, who faced the end of their entire civilization while struggling with personal desires that could never be acknowledged. Their stories will show us what happened when political collapse stripped away all the elaborate systems that other rulers had used to protect their authentic selves. Imagine being the emperor of a 1,000-year empire that's slowly dying around you. Picture walking through palaces that once hosted the most sophisticated court in the world, now with empty rooms and unpaid servants. The Byzantine Empire in its final decades was a shadow of its former glory. A few cities, crumbling walls, and the constant terror of Ottoman armies closing in from all sides. Yet even as Constantinople prepared for its final siege, the last two emperors of this ancient realm were still grappling with the same forbidden desires that had haunted rulers throughout history. Their stories reveal something profound about human nature. Even when facing the end of civilization itself, the heart still yearns for authentic connection. John VIII, Palaiologos, ruled the dying Byzantine Empire from 1425 to 1448, watching his realm shrink year by year as Ottoman forces captured one city after another. By the time John became emperor, Byzantium consisted of little more than Constantinople itself, a few surrounding territories, and some scattered outposts that could fall at any moment. Yet this desperate political situation created an unexpected form of personal freedom that would have been impossible during the empire's golden age. Here's what makes John's story so fascinating. As the Byzantine Empire collapsed, so did many of the rigid court protocols that had governed imperial behaviour for centuries. John couldn't afford to maintain the elaborate ceremonial distance that had traditionally separated Byzantine emperors from their subjects. He needed every capable person he could find, regardless of their background or his personal feelings about them. And this practical necessity created space for relationships that would have been unthinkable during the empire's height. The most documented of John's relationships was with George Gemistos Scholarios, a brilliant young scholar who became not just John's advisor, but his constant companion during the empire's darkest hours. Unlike the elaborate court relationships we've seen in other empires, John and Scholarios' connection was born from shared desperation and mutual dependence in the face of overwhelming odds. Contemporary accounts by the Byzantine historian Laonikos Chalkokondyles describe how John and Scholarios would spend entire nights planning defense strategies, negotiating with potential allies, and discussing the philosophical implications of the empire's probable demise. But Chalkokondyles also noted that their relationship involved what he carefully called intimate personal consultations that went far beyond military and political planning. What's really remarkable is how the approaching end of the empire stripped away pretense and allowed for unprecedented emotional honesty. John couldn't afford to maintain imperial dignity when there might not be an empire left to rule. Court records from this period, preserved in the Vatican after Constantinople's fall, show John openly displaying affection and emotional dependence on his male companions in ways that would have scandalized earlier Byzantine courts. The Venetian merchant and diplomat Niccolo Barbaro, who was present during the final siege of Constantinople, wrote detailed accounts of John's court that reveal how political collapse affected personal relationships. Barbaro noted that John seemed to care more about the welfare of his intimate companions than about imperial protocol, often sharing his personal quarters with young men and making no attempt to hide his emotional attachments. But here's where John's story becomes truly tragic. His authentic relationships became a source of political weakness at exactly the moment when the empire needed maximum strength and unity. Byzantine nobles, already demoralized by military defeats and economic collapse, were further alienated by their emperor's unconventional behavior. Some historians argue that John's personal relationships contributed to the political fragmentation that made effective resistance to the Ottomans impossible. John died in 1448, just 5 years before Constantinople's final fall, but not before seeing his beloved Scholarios convert to Islam and join the Ottoman administration. The personal betrayal was devastating, but it also symbolized the broader collapse of all the systems and loyalties that had sustained the Byzantine Empire for over a millennium. Now we come to one of the most tragic figures in European history, Constantine XII, Palaiologos, the last emperor of Byzantium, who faced the final siege of Constantinople in 1453, knowing that he was probably watching the end of his entire civilization. Constantine's story reveals what happened when all the elaborate systems that rulers had used to protect forbidden relationships simply ceased to exist. Constantine became emperor in 1449, inheriting what was essentially a city-state under siege. The Ottoman Empire controlled virtually all the territory around Constantinople. The Byzantine treasury was empty, and Western European powers were either unable or unwilling to provide meaningful assistance. Constantine knew from the moment he took the throne that he was probably the last emperor of Byzantium, and this knowledge profoundly affected his approach to both ruling and personal relationships. The most documented relationship in Constantine's final years was with Giovanni Giustiniani, a Genoese military engineer who came to Constantinople to help organize the city's defenses. But what started as a professional military partnership quickly became something much more personal and intense. Contemporary sources describe how Constantine became emotionally dependent on Giustiniani in ways that went far beyond normal relationships between a ruler and a military advisor. The Florentine merchant Jacopo Tedaldi, who was trapped in Constantinople during the final siege, wrote detailed accounts of Constantine's behavior that reveal the emperor's desperate need for human connection in the face of approaching doom. Tedaldi noted that Constantine would spend entire days with Giustiniani, supposedly planning defensive strategies, but that observers could see the emperor's emotional attachment was as much personal as professional. Here's what makes Constantine's story so heartbreaking. The approaching end of his empire created both unprecedented freedom and unbearable psychological pressure. Constantine could openly display affection for male companions because traditional imperial protocol had essentially collapsed. But this freedom came at the cost of knowing that everything he cared about, his empire, his city, his relationships, was about to be destroyed forever. Byzantine court records from the final months before the siege show Constantine making desperate attempts to preserve not just his empire, but his personal relationships. He wrote letters to Western European rulers begging for military assistance, but he also wrote private letters to male friends and companions, asking them to flee Constantinople before the final assault. The contrast between his public desperation and private tenderness reveals the full complexity of his situation. The most tragic document from this period is a letter Constantine wrote to a young Byzantine noble named Michael Tsykondiles, urging him to escape to Italy before the city fell. Constantine wrote, "I cannot bear the thought that your life should be lost in the ruin of our empire. Whatever happens to me, you must survive to remember what we were and what we shared." This isn't the language of political alliance. This is the language of profound personal love. When the final assault on Constantinople began on May 29th, 1453, Constantine chose to die fighting on the city walls rather than flee or surrender. Contemporary accounts describe him removing his imperial regalia and fighting as an ordinary soldier, accompanied by his closest companions including Giustiniani. The symbolism is devastating. The last emperor of Byzantium died not as a remote ceremonial figure, but as a man surrounded by the people he loved most. Constantine's body was never definitively identified after the battle, but Ottoman sources suggest he was found among a group of dead Byzantine defenders who had fought together to the end. The man who could have been the last emperor to live openly with male companions died with them in the ruins of the empire that had both constrained and protected such relationships for over 1,000 years. What's really striking about both John VIII and Constantine V is how the collapse of their empire revealed the artificial nature of many royal constraints around personal relationships. When the elaborate protocols and religious orthodoxies that had governed Byzantine court life began to break down, both emperors found themselves free to live more authentically. But this freedom came at the cost of watching their entire civilization disappear. The Byzantine experience shows us something profound about the relationship between political stability and personal authenticity. Throughout our journey, we've seen how rulers in stable empires developed elaborate systems for managing forbidden relationships. But John and Constantine's stories reveal that when those systems collapse, the resulting freedom can be both liberating and devastating. Both emperors died knowing that they were the end of a line stretching back over 1,000 years. Their personal relationships, however authentic and meaningful, couldn't compensate for the larger tragedy of imperial collapse. They found love and companionship in their final years, but they found it in the shadow of civilization's end. The irony is heartbreaking. The Byzantine Empire's final emperors achieved a level of personal authenticity that would have been impossible during the empire's height, but they achieved it only because everything else they might have wanted to preserve was being destroyed around them. As the ancient world finally died with Constantine V on the walls of Constantinople, a new era was beginning in Western Europe, one where royal relationships would be constrained by different rules but driven by the same fundamental human needs. Our next stop takes us into the 19th century, where two kings discovered that even in an age of increasing democracy and social reform, royal authenticity remained as dangerous and necessary as ever. The stories of Ludwig I of Bavaria and George IV of England will show us how modern monarchy created its own unique forms of prison for rulers who couldn't or wouldn't conform to conventional expectations. The 19th century changed everything about what it meant to be a king. Suddenly, royal power was being questioned by democratic movements. Newspapers were reporting on royal scandals with unprecedented freedom, and the old systems of court secrecy were collapsing under the pressure of public scrutiny. You might think this would make forbidden relationships even more dangerous for rulers, but something unexpected happened instead. Two kings discovered that the modern world's obsession with royal scandal could actually provide cover for authentic relationships, if you were clever enough to manipulate public attention in the right directions. Ludwig I of Bavaria came to the throne in 1825, inheriting a kingdom that was rapidly modernizing but still deeply traditional. Bavaria was caught between the old Holy Roman Empire traditions and the new nationalism sweeping across Europe, creating a unique space where a creative king could experiment with entirely new approaches to royal authenticity. And Ludwig was nothing if not creative. He turned scandal into spectacle, controversy into cultural achievement, and forbidden desire into public art. Here's what makes Ludwig's story so fascinating. Instead of hiding his unconventional relationships, he created such elaborate public dramas around his official romantic scandals that nobody noticed his deeper emotional connections with men. Ludwig essentially used heterosexual scandal as camouflage for homosexual authenticity, turning the media's obsession with royal love affairs into protection for relationships that could never be officially acknowledged. The most famous example is Ludwig's notorious relationship with Lola Montez, the Irish-born dancer who became his mistress and allegedly influenced Bavarian politics. The scandal was so explosive that it ultimately cost Ludwig his throne in 1848. But what historians often miss is that during the height of the Lola Montez affair, Ludwig was simultaneously conducting his most intense emotional relationship with a young male courtier named Georg von Dillis. Contemporary court records reveal that while Bavaria's newspapers were obsessing over every detail of the Lola Montez scandal, Ludwig was spending far more private time with Dillis, a talented artist and scholar who had become his closest confidant and companion. The Bavarian court chamberlain, Count Karl von Rechberg, wrote in his private diary about Ludwig's extraordinary dependence on Dillis, and noted that the king seemed more emotionally invested in his friendship with the young artist than in his celebrated affair with the Spanish dancer. What's really remarkable is how Ludwig used his artistic patronage to create legitimate spaces for intimate relationships with young men. Ludwig commissioned dozens of male artists, poets, and scholars to live at court, supposedly to work on cultural projects that would make Munich a centre of German art and literature. But court observers noted that these artistic collaborations often involved far more personal interaction than creative work required. The Prussian diplomat Friedrich von Gentz, who visited Ludwig's court in 1834, wrote detailed reports describing a cultural environment unlike anything else in German-speaking Europe. Gentz noted that Ludwig had created a court where beautiful young men are celebrated as much for their personal charm as for their artistic talents, and that the king's relationship with these artist courtiers involved an intimacy that goes far beyond normal royal patronage. Ludwig's genius was using Bavarian Catholic culture's tradition of celebrating male beauty in religious art to create secular spaces for similar appreciation. The king commissioned hundreds of paintings and sculptures featuring beautiful young men in classical and romantic settings, essentially surrounding himself with images that reflected his aesthetic and emotional preferences, while remaining technically appropriate for a Catholic court. But here's where Ludwig's strategy becomes really sophisticated. He understood that 19th century newspaper culture was obsessed with heterosexual royal scandals, but largely ignored same-sex relationships that weren't explicitly sexual. By creating dramatic public controversies around his relationships with women like Lola Montez, Ludwig ensured that media attention focused on scandals he could survive while ignoring relationships that could have destroyed him. The Bavarian archives contain extensive correspondence between Ludwig and various young male artists that reveals the depth of these relationships. In letters to the painter Wilhelm von Kaulbach, Ludwig wrote about his deep spiritual connection and emotional dependence on their friendship. These weren't just patron-artist relationships, they were intense emotional bonds that sustained Ludwig through the pressures of modern monarchy. But Ludwig's approach ultimately failed because he underestimated how much political instability his manufactured scandals would create. The 1848 revolutions that swept across Europe used Ludwig's apparent weakness for inappropriate relationships as justification for demanding his abdication. His strategy of using heterosexual scandal to hide homosexual authenticity worked too well. The public drama he created to protect his private life ultimately made his position as king untenable. Now let's cross the English Channel to examine a completely different approach to the same basic challenge. George IV ruled Britain during one of the most politically turbulent periods in English history, but he discovered that the constraints of constitutional monarchy could actually provide more protection for forbidden relationships than the absolute power enjoyed by earlier kings. George became Prince Regent in 1811 and King in 1820, ruling a Britain that was rapidly industrializing, democratizing, and expanding its global empire. But George had absolutely no interest in being a modern constitutional monarch who performed dignified public duties while living a carefully regulated private life. Instead, he used his position to create one of the most flamboyant and scandalous courts in European history. The most documented of George's relationships was with the Duke of Wellington, the military hero who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. But this wasn't just a political partnership between king and general. Contemporary accounts describe an emotional intimacy that surprised and sometimes scandalized observers who expected more formal royal ministerial relationships. The diarist Charles Greville, who had extensive access to court circles, wrote detailed observations about George's relationship with Wellington that reveal its personal nature. Greville noted that George would become agitated and melancholy when Wellington was absent on military campaigns, and that their reunions involved displays of mutual affection that exceeded normal courtesy between sovereign and subject. But here's what makes George's story so different from earlier English kings. The constitutional system that limited his political power actually provided protection for his personal relationships. Because George couldn't make major political decisions without parliamentary approval, his emotional dependence on male favourites couldn't create the kind of governmental instability that had destroyed kings like Edward II. George's relationship with another close companion, Sir William Knighton, reveals how the constitutional system worked to his advantage. Knighton served as George's private secretary and personal physician, but court observers noted that their relationship involved far more intimacy than these official roles required. The political journalist William Cobbett wrote that George seemed incapable of making personal decisions without consulting Knighton, and that the king's emotional dependence on his secretary was remarkable even by royal standards. What's really fascinating is how George used the British press's obsession with royal extravagance to create cover for relationships that might otherwise have attracted unwanted attention. George's spending on architecture, fashion, and court entertainment was so excessive that it generated constant political controversy. But this controversy focused on his financial irresponsibility rather than his personal relationships. The Brighton Pavilion, George's most famous architectural project, reveals how this strategy worked in practice. The building's exotic oriental design and enormous cost created a national scandal about royal extravagance, but it also provided George with a private retreat where he could entertain male companions away from London court protocol. The pavilion's elaborate guest quarters and private dining rooms were specifically designed to accommodate intimate gatherings, that would have been impossible in more formal royal residences. British parliamentary records from George's reign show how constitutional monarchy inadvertently protected his personal freedom. Because Parliament controlled royal finances and could investigate royal expenditures, there was extensive documentation of George's public activities, but very little official scrutiny of his private relationships. The system that was designed to limit royal power actually created privacy protection that absolute monarchs like Ludwig couldn't enjoy. But the psychological cost of George's approach was enormous. Contemporary accounts describe him as increasingly isolated and paranoid as his reign progressed, apparently unable to distinguish between genuine friendship and political manipulation. The Duke of Wellington himself wrote that George seemed desperate for authentic human connection, but incapable of trusting anyone enough to achieve it. Both Ludwig and George represent the unique challenges facing 19th century monarchs who are trying to live authentically in an age of increasing democratic scrutiny and media attention. Ludwig's strategy of manufacturing heterosexual scandal to hide homosexual relationships was brilliant, but ultimately self-destructive. George's approach of using constitutional limitations as protection for personal freedom was more sustainable, but psychologically isolating. What's really striking is how both men's personal struggles reflected broader changes in European society. The 19th century was creating new possibilities for individual authenticity and self-expression, but it was also creating new forms of public scrutiny and political pressure that made royal authenticity more dangerous than ever. Both kings died knowing that they had failed to find sustainable solutions to the fundamental problem of living authentically while maintaining royal authority. Ludwig abdicated in disgrace and spent his final years in exile, increasingly bitter about the political system that had forced him to choose between personal happiness and public duty. George died on the throne but had become so isolated and unpopular that his death was barely mourned by his subjects. As we approach the final chapter of our journey through royal secrets, we'll discover how the 20th century created entirely new challenges and opportunities for forbidden relationships among the last generation of truly powerful European monarchs. The stories of Alfonso III of Spain and Carol II of Romania will show us what happened when modern media, world wars and political revolution finally stripped away the last protections that had allowed kings to maintain their secrets for over 2 millennia. The 20th century shattered every rule we've explored on this journey. Suddenly, newspapers could photograph kings in private moments, radio could broadcast royal scandals across entire continents, and 2 world wars were toppling monarchies that had survived for centuries. The old systems of court secrecy, religious protection, and aristocratic discretion were collapsing under the pressure of mass media and democratic revolution. For the last generation of truly powerful European kings, living authentically became not just personally dangerous but politically impossible. Yet even in this hostile environment, 2 final monarchs found ways to pursue forbidden relationships, and their stories reveal both the end of an era and the eternal nature of human desire. Alfonso III of Spain ruled from 1886 to 1931, witnessing his country's transformation from a fading imperial power to a modern European nation struggling with industrial unrest, regional separatism, and the aftermath of World War I. But Alfonso also had to navigate something no previous Spanish king had faced: a press that was increasingly free to investigate and report on royal behaviour, and a public that was losing its traditional reverence for monarchy. Here's what makes Alfonso's story so compelling. He was the first Spanish king who couldn't rely on the Inquisition or church censorship to suppress inconvenient truths about his personal life. The Spanish press of the 1920s was remarkably free by historical standards, and journalists were actively looking for royal scandals that could sell newspapers to an increasingly literate public. Alfonso had to develop entirely new strategies for protecting relationships that earlier Spanish kings could have hidden through religious authority or court protocol. The most documented of Alfonso's relationships was with Captain Luis de Figueroa, a young cavalry officer who became Alfonso's aide-de-camp and constant companion throughout the 1920s. But unlike the elaborate court ceremonies that had hidden similar relationships in previous centuries, Alfonso and Figueroa had to navigate their connection in full view of newspaper photographers, foreign correspondents, and political opponents who were actively seeking evidence of royal impropriety. Contemporary newspaper accounts reveal how Alfonso managed this impossible situation. The Spanish press regularly reported on the king's military activities, hunting expeditions and ceremonial duties, but they consistently noted Figueroa's presence without ever directly commenting on the nature of their relationship. Alfonso had essentially trained the Spanish media to accept his companion's constant presence as normal royal protocol. But here's where Alfonso's story becomes really innovative. He used Spain's political instability to create protection for his personal relationships. Because Spain was facing constant governmental crises, military pronunciamientos, and regional rebellions throughout the 1920s, Alfonso could justify spending extensive private time with his military advisors, including Figueroa, as necessary consultation about national security threats. The British diplomat Sir Esme Howard, who served as ambassador to Spain during this period, wrote detailed reports about Alfonso's court that reveal how this system worked. Howard noted that Alfonso would conduct what appeared to be urgent military planning sessions with Figueroa that often lasted entire days and continued late into the night. But Howard also observed that these military consultations seemed to involve far more personal interaction than strategic planning required. Alfonso's approach was essentially to use 20th century political chaos as cover for 19th century emotional needs. The constant threat of revolution, the ongoing problems in Spanish Morocco, and the general political instability of the 1920s provided legitimate reasons for the king to maintain close relationships with young military officers who understood his personal as well as political vulnerabilities. But the strategy ultimately failed because Alfonso underestimated how quickly 20th century political movements could mobilize public opinion against monarchy itself. When the Spanish Republic was declared in 1931, Alfonso's personal relationships became part of the broader case against royal privilege and traditional authority. Republican newspapers published detailed accounts of the king's favourites and companions, not because they cared about his personal life, but because they wanted to demonstrate the irrelevance and corruption of monarchical institutions. Alfonso died in exile in Rome in 1941, having spent his final decade watching European monarchy collapse under the pressures of war, revolution, and social change. His attempt to use modern political chaos as protection for traditional royal relationships had been overwhelmed by forces larger than any individual king could control. Our final story takes us to Romania, where Carol III represented the absolute end of the old European royal system. Carol ruled from 1930 to 1940, during the rise of fascism, the approach of World War II, and the final destruction of the multinational empires that had dominated European politics for centuries. His story reveals what happened when a king tried to live authentically in a world where monarchy itself was becoming obsolete. Carol III came to the throne in 1930 after a scandalous abdication and return that had already marked him as a king who prioritized personal desire over royal duty. He had previously given up his succession rights to marry his mistress, Elena Lupescu, only to return years later and reclaim the throne when his young son proved incapable of ruling effectively. This background created a unique situation. Carol was a king whose personal relationships had already caused one constitutional crisis, making him simultaneously more vulnerable and more free than other monarchs. The most documented of Carol's relationships was with Armand Călinescu, his prime minister and closest advisor, who became what contemporary observers called the king's most intimate confidant. But this relationship existed in full view of international media, Nazi agents, Soviet spies, and Romanian political opponents, who were all actively gathering intelligence about potential weaknesses in Carol's regime. Romanian government archives, made available after 1989, reveal the extraordinary extent to which Carol's personal relationships influenced Romanian foreign policy during one of the most dangerous periods in European history. Călinescu wasn't just Carol's political advisor, he was his emotional anchor during the impossible task of keeping Romania independent, while Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia carved up Eastern Europe. German diplomatic records from this period show how foreign powers attempted to manipulate Carol through his personal relationships. Nazi intelligence reports describe detailed plans to either compromise Călinescu or replace him with someone more favourable to German interests, understanding that controlling Carol's closest companion was the key to controlling Romanian policy. But here's what makes Carol's story so tragic. His authentic relationship with Călinescu may have been one of the few things that kept Romania from complete political collapse during the late 1930s. Their personal trust and emotional connection allowed for rapid decision-making and policy coordination that would have been impossible through normal governmental channels. The relationship ended in 1939 when Călinescu was assassinated by members of the Iron Guard, Romania's fascist movement. Carol's reaction was immediate and devastating. He ordered mass executions of Iron Guard members and imposed martial law that effectively ended Romanian democracy. Contemporary accounts describe Carol as being emotionally destroyed by Călinescu's death, unable to function effectively as king without his closest companion. Carol abdicated in 1940 and spent the rest of his life in exile, dying in Portugal in 1953. He was the last European king whose personal relationships had direct impact on international politics, representing the end of a tradition that stretched back over 2 millennia. As we reach the end of our journey through these 30 royal secrets, what strikes me most is how universal and timeless these stories really are. From Alexander the Great in ancient Macedonia to Karol Vector in 20th century Romania, we've seen the same fundamental human needs playing out across different cultures, religions, and political systems. Every one of these kings, whether they ruled through absolute power or constitutional constraint, whether they lived in tolerant Renaissance courts or repressive medieval societies, faced the same basic challenge: how to be authentic while meeting the impossible expectations placed on royal authority. Some found creative solutions that allowed them to live and love authentically within the constraints of their time. Others were destroyed by the contradictions between personal desire and public duty. But all of them remind us that behind every crown, every ceremony, and every display of royal power was a human being struggling with the same needs for connection, understanding, and authentic love that drive all of us. These stories have been hidden for centuries, buried in diplomatic archives, disguised in court protocols, and coded in artistic patronage. But they're finally emerging as historians gain access to new sources and develop new frameworks for understanding the complex relationship between power and personal authenticity. What we've discovered is that the history of forbidden royal love is really the history of human creativity in the face of impossible constraints. These 30 kings found ways to build meaningful relationships despite religious persecution, political opposition, and social rejection. Their strategies, From Alexander's public mourning rituals to Henry III's theatrical performances, from Frederick the Great's philosophical salons to Ludwig III's artistic scandals, show us the incredible lengths people will go to live authentically. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through some of history's most closely guarded secrets. We've travelled from ancient empires to modern nations, explored the rise and fall of dynasties, and uncovered love stories that shaped the course of European civilization. These weren't just kings, they were human beings whose courage to love authentically, despite impossible odds, ultimately made them more powerful and memorable than any crown or conquest ever could. I hope these stories have given you a new perspective on both royal history and the universal human experience of seeking authentic connection in a world that often demands conformity. The next time you visit a palace, see a royal portrait, or read about historical kings, remember that behind all that pageantry and power were real people facing the same fundamental challenges we all face in living authentic, meaningful lives. Keep exploring, keep questioning the official stories, and keep looking for the human truth behind historical legends. There are so many more incredible secrets waiting to be discovered, and I can't wait to share them with you. Until next time, sweet dreams, and remember, love always finds a way, even in the most impossible circumstances.